The first thing I noticed about the tower was how much it swayed. Not dramatically, not in any way that felt dangerous, but enough that when I set a cup of water on the desk that first afternoon, I could see the surface trembling. A faint, continuous vibration, like the whole structure was breathing. The ranger who drove me in, a woman named Carla with sun-damaged skin and a voice that sounded like she'd been awake for several days, told me that was normal. She said the tower was built to give. That was the word she used. Give. The bolts and crossbeams were designed with enough flex to handle wind loads up to 70 miles per hour. Anything above that, she said, and I should get below the catwalk and radio in. She didn't say what would happen at that point. I didn't ask. The drive had taken just under 4 hours from the district office in Winthrop, the last two on unpaved Forest Service roads that narrowed steadily until we were pushing through brush on both sides. Carla didn't talk much. She pointed out a few landmarks as we climbed an elevation. A creek crossing that could flood in late spring. A wide meadow where they'd staged a burnout operation 2 summers ago. The charred trunks were still standing, pale and stripped, scattered through the new growth like old teeth. I watched them pass and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not sadness. Something closer to the feeling of entering a room where a conversation has just stopped. The tower itself sat at the top of a rocky ridge, maybe 50 feet of steel lattice bolted to a concrete pad, with a 14 by 14-foot cab on top. Glass on all 4 sides. A narrow catwalk wrapped around the outside. Inside there was a cot, a desk, a propane stove, a fire finder mounted on a pedestal in the center of the room, and a radio bolted to the wall beside the north-facing window. The fire finder was an Osborne, the old circular kind with a sighting ring and a map underneath the glass. It was beautiful in a way I hadn't expected. The brass was dull, but still precise, and when I turned the ring, it moved with a smoothness that suggested decades of careful use. Carla walked me through the equipment, radio protocol, frequency assignments, the daily weather observation schedule. She showed me how to read the psychrometer and the wind gauge mounted on the roof, how to fill out the 10-day log sheets where the backup batteries were stored. She was thorough, but not patient. She had the manner of someone who had explained these things many times and was no longer interested in whether the explanation landed. I nodded and took notes in a small book I'd brought, and she watched me write with an expression I couldn't read. Before she left, she handed me the handbook. It was a Forest Service publication, maybe 40 pages, with a green cover that had faded to the color of old sage. The corners were soft and round from handling. Inside, someone had highlighted sections on fire behavior and smoke color identification, and there were margin notes in at least 3 different handwritings. One person had drawn small diagrams of cloud formations. Another had written phone numbers that were no longer in service. I flipped through it while Carla loaded her gear back into the truck. That's when I found the line. It was on the inside of the back cover, written in pencil, faint but legible. The handwriting was small and careful, the kind of printing you'd see from someone used to filling out forms. If the trees start moving, close your eyes. No date, no initials, no context. Just that one sentence, sitting alone on the inside of the cover, like it had always been there. I brought it to Carla. I held the book open and showed her, and she looked at it for a moment with no change in expression. She said that previous lookouts sometimes left notes. She said some people didn't do well with the isolation and that the handbook accumulated things over the years. She didn't say the note was a joke, and she didn't say it was serious. She closed the tailgate of the truck and told me my first weather observation was due at 1300, which gave me about 2 hours to settle in. Then she drove away, and the sound of the engine faded down the ridge, and I was alone. I stood on the catwalk for a while after she left. The view was extraordinary, the kind of thing you see in photographs but never quite trust until you're standing inside it. The forest spread in every direction, a vast unbroken canopy of Douglas fir and western red cedar and hemlock, dark green and dense, filling the valleys and climbing the opposite ridges until it thinned near the higher elevations where rock and alpine meadow took over. To the south, I could see a chain of peaks still holding snow. To the north and east, just trees, miles of them. The canopy had a texture from this distance, a kind of roughness, like the surface of a deep green ocean, frozen mid-swell. I could see the wind moving through it in long, slow waves, patches of lighter color where the branches turned and showed their undersides, rolling across the treetops like something passing underneath. I went inside and unpacked my things. I'd brought more books than clothes, which felt like a mistake almost immediately, because the shelf space was limited and the cot took up most of one wall. I arranged what I could and stowed the rest in a duffel under the desk. I made coffee on the propane stove and sat in the chair by the fire finder and looked out the windows and tried to understand what I had agreed to. 12 weeks. That was the contract. Mid-June through early September, the fire season in the North Cascades. I had taken the job for reasons that seemed clear at the time, but were already becoming difficult to articulate. I had left a teaching position in Bellingham. I had ended a relationship that had lasted longer than it should have. I wanted quiet, and I wanted distance, and I wanted a task that was simple and defined. Watch for fire. Report what you see. There was an appealing clarity to it. The job was entirely about observation. You sat in a glass room above the world, and you looked, and if you saw something that mattered, you picked up the radio and said so. That was the whole thing. My first weather observation went fine. Temperature, 61 degrees. Relative humidity, 44%. Wind out of the southwest at 8 miles per hour, gusting to 12. Cloud cover scattered. Cumulus. Base at maybe 8,000 feet. I read the instruments, filled in the form, and radioed the numbers to dispatch. A man's voice acknowledged with the call sign and read back my figures, and that was it. The entire exchange took less than a minute. I set the form on the desk and looked at the clock and realized I had 11 hours and 47 minutes until the next one. That first week was an education in time. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean that I had never before understood how long an hour actually was. In my previous life, time had been structured by other people, by classes and meetings and meals and obligations that divided the day into segments that passed without my noticing. Here, time was raw material. It accumulated. I would scan the horizon, check the fire finder, look at my watch, and discover that 4 minutes had passed. I would read a chapter of a book, feel certain that an hour had gone by, and find that it had been 20 minutes. The days were 16 hours long, and every one of those hours had to be filled with something, and there was almost nothing to fill them with. I developed routines quickly, out of necessity. Morning weather observation at 0600, coffee and breakfast, a full scan of the horizon using the fire finder, starting north and rotating clockwise, noting anything that might be smoke or haze. Mid-morning radio check. A walk around the catwalk to inspect the equipment, the anemometer, the rain gauge, the solar panel that charged the backup battery. Lunch. Afternoon observation at 1300. Another full scan. Reading. Evening observation at 1800. Dinner. The long, slow twilight, which at this latitude in late June lasted until nearly 10 o'clock, the sky going through shades of orange and violet that I initially found stunning and eventually found routine, which itself was a kind of loss I tried not to think about. The nights were different. After dark, there was nothing to observe. The forest became a black absence below me, a vast space defined only by the absence of stars along the horizon. I could hear it, though. The wind in the canopy made a sound like distant water, a continuous, layered rushing that rose and fell without ever stopping entirely. On still nights, I could hear individual trees, the creak of wood under stress, the dry rattle of dead branches shifting, occasionally something else, a crack or a thump that could have been a falling limb or a large animal moving through brush. I would lie on the cot and listen, and the sounds would weave together into something almost like music, and I would sleep. I thought about the note in the handbook a few times during that first week, but not seriously. If the trees start moving, close your eyes. It read like the kind of thing a bored person writes when they've been alone too long. The trees were always moving. That was one of the first things I'd learned. The wind was nearly constant at this elevation, and the canopy responded to it in ways that were endlessly varied. Gusts would sweep across the ridges, and the trees would bow and recover, and the motion would propagate through the forest in visible waves. It was one of the few things that never became boring. I could watch the wind move through the trees for 20 minutes and still find it interesting. So the idea that the trees might start moving was, as a premise, almost meaningless. They never stopped. Unless the note meant something else. Unless moving meant something specific that I hadn't yet learned to recognize. I let that thought go. It was easy to do in those first days. The job was new enough that the routines still required attention, and the solitude hadn't yet shifted from chosen to imposed. I was still in the phase where being alone felt like freedom. The second week, I started keeping a personal journal alongside the official logs. I don't know exactly why. I think I wanted a record that was mine, separate from the weather data and the fire reports, something that captured what it actually felt like to be here, rather than just the measurable conditions. I wrote about the light mostly. The way it changed through the day, how the forest looked different at 7 in the morning than at 7 in the evening, even though the sun was at the same angle, just mirrored. I wrote about the birds. Steller's jays were the most common visitors to the tower, bold and loud, landing on the catwalk railing to watch me through the glass with that peculiar, tilted focus that birds have. Clark's nutcrackers higher up, near the tree line, hawks circling in the thermals that rose off the south-facing slopes in the afternoon. I also wrote about the tree line, not because anything was wrong with it, but because it was the dominant feature of my visual world, and I was trying to find language for it. The nearest trees were maybe 200 yards from the base of the tower, where the ridge dropped off and the forest began. From the cab, looking down and out, the canopy appeared as a continuous surface, dark and textured, broken only by occasional snags, dead trees still standing, their bare trunks and branches jutting above the green like bones. The tree line was sharpest to the west, where a natural meadow created a clear boundary between grass and forest. I used that meadow as a reference point during my scans. It was shaped roughly like a stretched oval, maybe 300 yards long and 80 yards wide at its broadest point, and the trees along its western edge formed a remarkably straight line, as if they had been planted to a surveyor's mark. I noted that line in my journal on June 19th. I described it as unusually regular. I wrote that it looked almost artificial. Then I made my 1300 observation, radioed it in, and read for the rest of the afternoon. On June 22nd, I had my first real conversation over the radio. Not a weather report, not a check-in, but an actual exchange. A lookout named Davis, stationed at a tower I couldn't see, maybe 30 miles to the southeast, called on the mutual aid frequency one evening and asked if anyone was awake. I answered, and we talked for about 40 minutes. He'd been doing this for 3 seasons. He told me about a fire he'd spotted the previous summer, how he'd watched the smoke column build from a thin white thread to a churning pillar in less than an hour, how the retardant planes had come in low enough that he could see the red slurry falling from their bellies. He told me about the elk that sometimes crossed the meadow near his tower at dawn, moving in single file through the wet grass. He asked me how I was handling the quiet, and I said fine, and I think we both knew that was only mostly true. Before we signed off, I asked him if he'd ever heard anything about the trees moving. There was a pause. Radio silence has a particular quality. It's not just the absence of speech, but the presence of static, a low hiss that fills the space and makes you aware of the distance between you and the other person. Davis came back and said he wasn't sure what I meant. I said I'd found a note in the handbook, something a previous lookout had written, and he said that old handbooks were full of strange things. He said someone at a tower in the Gifford-Pinchot district had once filled an entire logbook with drawings of spirals instead of weather data. He said isolation did things to people. He said it in a way that was kind rather than dismissive, and I appreciated that. After we signed off, I stood on the catwalk and looked at the forest in the late twilight. The wind had died to almost nothing, which was unusual. The canopy was still. I could see the meadow to the west, a pale shape in the dimming light, and the tree line along its edge. I looked at it for a while. Then I went inside and wrote in my journal that the tree line seemed the same as when I'd last described it. I wrote that sentence and then stared at it for a moment, wondering why I felt the need to confirm it. The days accumulated. I settled deeper into the routines, and the routines became invisible, which is to say, they became the structure of my life rather than activities I performed within it. I stopped noticing the swaying of the tower. I stopped checking my watch as often. The weather observations became automatic, a series of motions and readings that my hands performed while my mind drifted elsewhere. I could read the psychrometer and calculate the dew point spread without thinking about it. I could estimate wind speed from the motion of the trees before I even looked at the gauge. That was something I hadn't expected. The way you learn to read the forest. After enough hours of watching, you begin to understand its visual language. A gust of 20 miles per hour looks different from a gust of 30. The way individual species respond to wind is distinct. Douglas firs sway from the top, a slow, heavy arc. Hemlocks are more flexible, bending further down the trunk. Cedars barely move at all in moderate wind, but their flat sprays of foliage flutter in a way that creates a shimmering effect across the canopy. After 3 weeks, I could look at a section of forest and tell you the approximate wind speed and direction without any instruments, just from the way the trees were behaving. Which is why, on July 3rd, I noticed something I couldn't explain. It was mid-afternoon, maybe 14:30. I was doing a routine scan, working the firefinder around from north to east. The sky was clear, visibility excellent, and I was mostly going through the motions, not expecting to see anything. I paused with the sighting ring pointed northeast, toward a section of forest I'd looked at hundreds of times. Dense canopy, no features, no snags, just an unbroken field of dark green extending to the next ridge. The wind was out of the southwest at about 10 miles per hour, steady, and I could see it moving through the trees in the expected pattern, a gentle, rhythmic sway rolling from my left to my right as the wind pushed across the canopy, except in one area. Maybe a quarter mile out, maybe a little more, there was a section of canopy, perhaps an acre, perhaps slightly less, where the trees appeared to be swaying in a different direction. Not against the wind exactly, but at an angle to it, as if the wind in that particular spot was coming from a different quarter. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds. The motion was subtle. If I hadn't spent weeks learning to read the wind in the trees, I probably wouldn't have noticed it at all. But it was there. A patch of forest moving to its own rhythm, slightly out of phase with everything around it. I looked away. I checked the wind gauge. Southwest at 11, gusting to 14. Consistent. I looked back at the area, and it took me a moment to find it again, and when I did, it seemed less pronounced. The difference was still there, I thought, but I was no longer certain. I watched for another minute, and the longer I watched, the harder it became to tell whether the motion was actually different or whether I was simply creating the difference by looking for it. There is a phenomenon in visual perception, I know this from my teaching days, where the act of focused attention can generate apparent patterns that aren't present in the stimulus. You stare at television static long enough, and you start to see shapes. You watch a field of grass in the wind, and you can convince yourself that something is moving through it. I was aware of this, and the awareness made me doubt what I was seeing, and the doubt made me look harder, and looking harder made the doubt worse. I wrote it in the log as a possible thermal anomaly. Localized wind variation, probably caused by differential heating of the terrain. The northeast slope would have been in partial shade by that time of day, and the transition between sunlit and shaded ground can create small convective cells that produce their own air currents. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. I wrote it down and moved on. But I kept coming back to that spot during my scans over the next few days. I couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to it the way your tongue is drawn to a chipped tooth. Each time I looked, the forest there appeared normal. The canopy moved with the wind, in the right direction, at the right speed. I began to feel faintly embarrassed, as if I'd been caught overreacting to something that was never there. By July 6th, I'd stopped looking specifically at that area and had resumed my normal scanning pattern. On July 8th, I woke before dawn and couldn't get back to sleep. This happened sometimes. The cot was not comfortable, and the wind had been gusty during the night, and the tower's swaying had been more pronounced than usual. I lay in the dark and listened to the forest and thought about nothing in particular, and eventually I got up and made coffee and went out on the catwalk to watch the sunrise. The dawn light in the mountains comes in stages. First the sky lightens, a slow bleaching of the darkness that begins in the east and spreads upward. Then the highest peaks catch the first direct light, turning gold and then white, while the valleys below are still in shadow. Then the light descends, pouring down the slopes, and the forest emerges from the dark in a wave of color that moves from the ridgelines down to the valley floors. It takes maybe 40 minutes from first light to full illumination on a clear day, and during that time, the forest goes through a sequence of appearances that are each distinct and transient. I was watching this process, leaning on the railing with my coffee, when I looked toward the meadow to the west. In the early light, it was a pale gold, the grass catching the low sun and glowing against the dark mass of the surrounding forest. I looked at the tree line along its western edge, the straight line I had noted in my journal weeks before, and I felt something shift in my perception, a subtle dislocation, like when you're reading and you realize you've been looking at the same sentence for a minute without processing it. The tree line was straight. It had always been straight. But it seemed closer to the meadow's center than I remembered. Not by much. By maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 yards. The meadow seemed slightly narrower at that point. I stared at it and tried to remember exactly what it had looked like when I'd first described it. I had written that it was 80 yards wide at its broadest. Was it still 80 yards? It was impossible to judge distance that precisely from the tower, especially in the changing light of early morning. I was looking at it from above and at an angle, and depth perception at that distance is unreliable. I knew this. I went inside and found my journal entry from June 19th, 80 yards wide at its broadest point. I looked out the window at the meadow. I couldn't tell. It might have been 80 yards. It might have been 70. The difference, if there was one, was within the margin of error of a visual estimate from a quarter-mile away. I considered going down to measure it. The thought entered my mind, and I examined it and decided it was unreasonable. It would take an hour to climb down the tower, walk to the meadow, pace off the width, and climb back up. During that time, I would be away from my post and unable to scan for smoke. For what? To confirm that a meadow was the same width it had always been. To prove that my memory of a casual estimate written 3 weeks ago was accurate. The idea was absurd. I was being absurd. I made my 6 o'clock observation. Temperature, 49 degrees. Humidity, 71%. Wind calm. Sky clear. I radioed it in. The day was ordinary. I did my scans, read my book, ate lunch, did more scans. The forest was the forest. I did not look at the meadow any more than was required by the normal rotation of my scanning pattern. That evening, I talked to Davis again on the radio. He told me about a black bear that had been hanging around the base of his tower, attracted by the smell of his cooking. He'd been banging pots together to scare it off, but it kept coming back. We laughed about it. I did not mention the meadow. I did not mention the patch of canopy that had seemed to be moving wrong. I didn't mention these things because there was nothing to mention. Nothing had happened. I had made imprecise observations and then been unsettled by their imprecision. That was all. July passed. The weather grew hotter and drier, and the fire danger increased. I started seeing smoke twice, both times thin white columns rising from the northeast, and both times I called them in with compass bearings and estimates of distance, and both times they turned out to be small fires that the crews reached quickly. The district fire management officer called me on the radio after the second one and said I had a good eye. I felt disproportionately pleased by this. The loneliness had reached the stage where any acknowledgement from another person felt like warmth, like stepping into sunlight after being in shade. The loneliness itself was a thing I was still learning to navigate. It wasn't constant. There were hours, sometimes whole days, where I felt perfectly content with my own company, absorbed in a book or a long observation of the landscape, present in a way that I rarely achieved in the cluttered, interruptive world below. But then there were other hours where the silence pressed in from all sides, and I became acutely aware that there was no one within miles of me, that if I fell on the stairs or cut myself badly while cooking, no one would know until the next morning when I failed to make my weather report. The isolation wasn't just distance. It was the knowledge that the distance was real, that the miles of forest between me and the nearest person were not a metaphor, but a physical fact, filled with terrain that would take days to cross on foot. I started talking to myself, not in a way that concerned me, just small narrations of what I was doing. Okay, checking the wind gauge. All right, time for coffee. Simple things just to hear a voice. I also started talking to the jays that landed on the catwalk. I gave them names, which I know is a cliché of isolation narratives, but I did it anyway because it made the mornings easier. There was a large one with a crooked tail feather that I called Bishop, and a smaller, more cautious one that I called Pearl, and they came most days around 7:30 and sat on the railing and screamed at me until I threw out some crumbs. It was during this period, the middle of July, that I started to have trouble with my logs, not the weather data. That was always precise because it came from instruments. The trouble was with my written observations, the descriptive notes I added to the log about visibility, cloud formations, smoke sightings, anything unusual. I began noticing small discrepancies between what I wrote and what I remembered writing. One morning, I reviewed the previous day's log and found a note about a haze layer to the south that I didn't remember seeing. The handwriting was mine. The observation was detailed and specific. Thin haze layer visible along southern horizon, approximately 5 to 8 miles, possibly smoke from controlled burn in Chelan district. It was plausible. There had been controlled burns in that area, but I had no memory of seeing haze the previous day, and no memory of writing that note. I attributed this to monotony. The days were so similar that they blurred together. It was entirely possible that I had seen haze and written about it, and then, because it was unremarkable, failed to encode it as a distinct memory. This happens to everyone. You drive to work and arrive with no memory of the drive because it was the same as every other drive. The lookout equivalent was logging an observation that was so routine it left no mark. I accepted this explanation and didn't think about it further, but it happened again. On July 17th, I found a note in my log that referenced a wind shift at 15:23. Wind shifted to northwest at 15:23, sustained 15, gusting 22. I remembered that afternoon clearly, or thought I did. I had been reading. The wind had been steady from the southwest all day. I did not remember a shift to the northwest, and a shift that significant would have been notable, would have changed the way the forest looked and sounded and felt. I would have noticed it. I was certain I would have noticed it. I checked the weather data for that day. The instrument readings at 1800, my evening observation showed wind from the southwest at 9 miles per hour. If there had been a significant shift to the northwest at 15:23, It had corrected itself by 1800. That was possible. Wind shifts happen and reverse. But the gap between the written observation and my memory troubled me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't that I thought the note was wrong. The handwriting was mine, the format was correct, the detail was specific enough to suggest direct observation. It was that I had no memory of the experience that should have accompanied the writing of that note, as if someone had extracted a segment of my afternoon and replaced it with a continuation of the hours on either side. I started paying closer attention to my logging. I began adding timestamps more carefully, and when I wrote an observation, I would pause afterward and deliberately commit it to memory. I would say to myself, I am writing this note about cirrus clouds at 1400, and I would try to anchor the moment with sensory details, the warmth of the sun through the glass, the feel of the pen, the specific quality of the light. It was a conscious effort to stitch my experience to the record, and for a while it seemed to work. The logs and my memory aligned. The discrepancies stopped, which should have been reassuring, but instead it made me wonder whether the earlier discrepancies had been real, or whether I had imagined them, and if I had imagined them, what that said about the reliability of my mind in this environment. I thought about the note in the handbook. I thought about what Davis had said. That isolation does things to people. I thought about the lookout who had filled a logbook with spirals. On July 21st, I ran out of the coffee I'd brought and had to open the supply cache in the storage compartment below the cab. The cache had been stocked before my arrival with canned food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, batteries, and several pounds of ground coffee in vacuum-sealed bags. I climbed down to the storage platform and opened the metal box and found everything in order. While I was there, I checked the structural bolts on the tower, which was part of the weekly maintenance I'd been taught. The bolts were fine. The tower was fine. Everything was fine. As I climbed back up, I paused on the stairs at a point where my eye level was just above the canopy. I was facing northeast, toward the area where I had seen the anomalous movement 2 weeks earlier. From this lower angle, the forest looked different. The canopy wasn't a surface anymore, but a mass, a dense tangle of branches and trunks that receded into shadow below the crown layer. I could see maybe 20 or 30 feet into the forest before the darkness became complete. The trees at the edge were large, old growth, their trunks 3 or 4 feet in diameter, spaced irregularly, their lower branches dead and bare, their crowns interlocking overhead. They had a stillness to them at this angle that was different from how they appeared from above. From the cab, the forest was an abstraction, a texture, a map. From here it was a place, a physical space with depth and darkness and the suggestion of interiority. Something could be in there. Many things were in there, deer and bear and cougar and owl, and all the unnamed smaller creatures that lived and fed and died under the canopy. But from here, knowing that intellectually was different from feeling it, the forest had presence. I went back up and made coffee and did my scan, and everything was normal. Late July was the hottest period. The temperatures climbed into the high 90s in the valleys, and even at my elevation, it reached the mid-80s in the afternoons. The fire danger went to extreme. I was told to increase my scanning frequency, and I did, moving from 3 full rotations a day to 5. The extra vigilance was good for me, I think. It gave me more to do, more structure, more purpose, and it meant I was looking at the forest more carefully and more often. which should have been comforting because it meant I had more data to compare, more reference points for what was normal. On July 26th, during my late morning scan, I noticed that the meadow to the west appeared to have changed shape. Not dramatically. The overall form was the same, an elongated oval, but the proportions seemed different. It looked shorter and wider than I remembered. I tried to compare it to my journal description from 5 weeks earlier, but the description wasn't detailed enough to confirm or deny what I was seeing. I had written the length as roughly 300 yards, and it still looked like roughly 300 yards. But rough estimates are useless when you're trying to detect a change of 10 or 20 yards at distance. I thought about this for a while. I sat with the firefinder and took compass bearings on both ends of the meadow and on the widest point of its eastern and western edges. I wrote these bearings down. If the meadow changed, the bearings would change, and that would be objective and measurable and not dependent on my memory or my perception. This felt like a good idea, a rational response to an irrational worry. The bearings were north end, 342 degrees, south end, 351 degrees, east edge at widest point, 345 degrees, west edge at widest point, 348 degrees. I recorded these in my personal journal, not in the official log, because I didn't want anyone at the district office to wonder why the lookout was taking compass bearings on a meadow. I checked those bearings the next day, and they were the same. I checked them the day after that, and they were the same. I checked them 4 days later, and the west edge bearing had shifted by half a degree. 348 had become 347.5. Half a degree. On the firefinder's scale, that was barely more than a hair's width. It was well within the range of measurement error. The firefinder was precise, but not infinitely so, and my ability to read it was limited by the steadiness of my hand and the alignment of my eye. I could have bumped the instrument. I could have read it slightly differently. Half a degree meant nothing, but it meant nothing in the wrong direction. If the west edge of the meadow was now at 347.5 instead of 348, that meant the bearing had shifted slightly to the east, which meant the tree line on the western edge of the meadow was slightly closer to the eastern edge, which meant the meadow was slightly narrower. I am going to describe what I did next because I think it's important for understanding how I was thinking at that time, and because it illustrates the way a small doubt can become a methodology. I made a chart. I drew a diagram of the meadow in my journal with the compass bearings labeled, and I committed to checking them every morning at the same time during my 0600 observation, using the same eye, my right, and the same hand position on the firefinder. I would record the bearings to the nearest half degree and track any changes over time. If the meadow was not changing, the data would show stability, and I could put the matter to rest. If it was changing, the data would show a trend, and I would have evidence. Evidence of what I didn't allow myself to think about. For 5 days the bearings were stable, 342, 351, 345, 347.5. Every morning, the same numbers. I began to relax. The half-degree shift on the west edge had been a measurement error, as expected, and now the numbers were holding steady because there was nothing to change. The meadow was a meadow. The trees were trees. I was a person alone in a tower whose mind was looking for problems because it didn't have enough to occupy it. On the 6th day, August 2nd, I took the bearings and the north end of the meadow had shifted. 342 had become 342.5, half a degree to the east. The south end was unchanged. The east and west edges were unchanged. Just the north end moving half a degree. I took the bearing again. 342.5. I took it a third time, very carefully, closing one eye and aligning the sighting wire with the exact point where the meadow grass ended and the first tree trunk began. 342.5. I sat down. I looked at my chart. The north end had moved east by half a degree. If this was real, it meant the tree line at the north end of the meadow had shifted slightly to the east and south, which meant what? That the meadow was being compressed from the northwest, that the forest was, at its northern boundary, fractionally closer to the meadow's center than it had been a week ago. I stared at the numbers and tried to calculate what half a degree of compass bearing translated to, in terms of actual distance at a range of maybe 400 yards. The math wasn't hard. At 400 yards, half a degree was roughly 3.5 yards. Was I claiming that the tree line had moved 3.5 yards? In a week? Trees don't move 3.5 yards. Trees don't move at all. The root systems of mature Douglas firs are massive and anchored and permanent. A tree is, definitionally, something that stays where it is. I closed the journal. I went outside and walked around the catwalk twice. The air was hot and dry, and the forest below was still, the wind not yet risen from its morning calm. I looked at the meadow. It looked like a meadow. It looked like the same meadow I had been staring at for 6 weeks. I could not see a 3.5-yard change in the tree line from a quarter mile away with my naked eye. The whole exercise was pointless. I was measuring noise and calling it signal. I went back inside and did my scan and didn't take the bearings the next morning, or the morning after that. I left the journal closed and returned to my routines and told myself that I was done with it. On August the 5th, I had a radio exchange that I have thought about many times since. It was late afternoon, and dispatch called with a request to provide a bearing on a possible smoke sighting reported by an aircraft. The pilot had seen what looked like a thin column southwest of my position, and they wanted a ground-level confirmation. I went to the firefinder and sighted along the bearing they gave me, 220 degrees. I looked carefully. The sky in that direction was clear. No smoke, no haze, nothing. I swept 10 degrees on either side and found nothing. I reported negative smoke to dispatch. The dispatcher acknowledged and then said something I didn't understand. He said, "Copy, negative smoke from Baker Ridge." I said, "Say again?" He said, "Negative smoke from Baker Ridge. That's your position, correct?" I said, "This is Desolation Peak Lookout." There was a pause. Then he said, "Right, copy, Desolation. Sorry about that." I didn't think much of it at the time. Dispatchers handle multiple lookouts, and they occasionally mix up call signs. Baker Ridge was another tower in the district, maybe 40 miles south. A simple mistake. But something about it lingered. Not the error itself, but the casualness of it. He had called me Baker Ridge without hesitation, as if that was what his records showed. As if, for a moment, my position in the system had been somewhere else. I looked up Baker Ridge on the map posted on the wall of the cab. It was where I expected it to be, well, to my south, in a different drainage entirely. I found Desolation Peak, my peak, in its correct location. Everything was where it should be. The radio error was just a radio error. I let it go. The next night, I couldn't sleep. This was becoming more common. The heat made the cab stuffy even with the windows cracked, and the absence of wind meant the tower didn't sway, which I had, without realizing it, come to depend on for comfort, the way a child depends on the motion of a rocking cradle. I lay on the cot and listened to the silence, which was not really silence, but the aggregated sound of a million small events in the dark forest below, and I thought about all the things I had been not thinking about. The inconsistent swaying, the meadow bearings, the log entries I didn't remember writing, the dispatch error. Individually, each one was nothing. Each had a simple, reasonable explanation, but together they formed a pattern that I couldn't quite see the shape of, a constellation of small wrongnesses that might be random or might be connected by something I hadn't identified. I got up and turned on the battery lantern, keeping it dim, and opened the handbook to the back cover. If the trees start moving, close your eyes. I read it several times. I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The pencil was faint, as I'd observed initially, but looking more closely in the low light, I could see that the letters had been traced more than once. The person hadn't written the sentence and moved on. They had gone back over it, retracing each letter carefully, reinforcing the marks, as if they wanted to make sure it would still be legible after years of handling, as if it was important that the next person be able to read it. I put the handbook away and went back to bed and eventually slept. August continued. The heat held. I spotted one more fire, a small lightning strike on a distant ridge, and called it in. The days were long and dry and identical. I maintained my routines. I did my scans. I read my books. I talked to Davis on the radio every few evenings, and he told me that the bear had finally lost interest in his tower, and I told him that Bishop the Jay had brought what appeared to be a mate, and we talked about small things in the way that people do when the small things are the only things that happen. I did not take compass bearings on the meadow. I did not look specifically at the northeast section where I'd seen the anomalous movement. I did not review old log entries for discrepancies. I performed my job and kept my observations routine, and did not investigate anything that was not directly related to fire detection. This was a deliberate choice, and I was aware of it as a deliberate choice, and I was aware that the need to make it deliberately meant something, but I chose not to examine what it meant. On August 14th, I broke. That's too dramatic a word. Nothing broke. What happened was that I was doing my late afternoon scan, and my eye passed over the northeast section, and I saw it again. The canopy was moving wrong. The wind was out of the west at 12 miles per hour, steady, and the trees across the visible landscape were responding uniformly, a gentle east-flowing wave across the treetops. But in that same area, maybe a quarter mile out, the canopy was moving differently. This time, I couldn't rationalize it as a thermal anomaly, because the motion wasn't random or circular, which is what convective turbulence would produce. The motion was directional. The trees in that patch were swaying from east to west against the prevailing wind. They were moving toward me. I watched for a long time. I don't know how long. The firefinder was pointed northeast, and my eye was at the sighting ring, and I watched the patch of canopy move in its wrong direction, while the forest around it moved in the right one. It was like watching a current in a river, a visible stream of contrary motion embedded in the larger flow. And the longer I watched, the more certain I became that it was real, and the more certain I became, the more I wanted to stop watching. I stepped back from the firefinder, I went to the window and looked with my naked eye, and from there, without magnification, I couldn't see it. The forest looked uniform. The canopy moved with the wind. I went back to the firefinder and sighted northeast, and there it was. The contrary motion, unmistakable. I picked up the radio. I don't know what I intended to say. I keyed the mic and then released it without speaking. What would I report? That a patch of trees was moving in the wrong direction? That the forest was doing something impossible? Dispatch would think I was having a breakdown. They would send someone to check on me, and by the time they arrived, the motion would have stopped, or I would be unable to find it, or it would look like ordinary wind variation to anyone who hadn't spent weeks learning the specific visual signature of this particular forest. I would have no evidence. I would have nothing but my own perception, and my perception was exactly what I was no longer sure I could trust. I set the radio down. I looked through the firefinder one more time. The contrary motion was still there, but it seemed, possibly, to be closer than before. Not by much. But the patch of wrong-moving canopy seemed to extend slightly farther toward the tower than it had 5 minutes ago. I stepped back and closed my eyes and stood in the middle of the cab with my eyes closed and my hands at my sides, and breathed. If the trees start moving, close your eyes. I kept them closed for what felt like a long time, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5. The tower swayed gently in the wind, and I could hear the forest making its usual sound, the layered rushing of the canopy, indistinguishable from any other afternoon. When I opened my eyes, I went immediately to the firefinder and sighted northeast. The canopy was moving with the wind. Uniform. Normal. The contrary motion was gone. I sat down heavily in the chair and looked at my hands and discovered that they were trembling slightly. I made fists and then released them and watched the trembling subside. Then I made my 1800 observation, which was late by 11 minutes, and radioed it in, and the dispatcher acknowledged without comment. In my journal that night, I wrote a single line. It happened. Then I stared at it and crossed it out and wrote instead, possible visual anomaly at approximately 1640, northeast sector, resolved after brief interruption of observation. Then I crossed that out too because it sounded clinical in a way that felt dishonest, and wrote nothing at all. The next few days were quiet, and the quiet felt different. Previously, the quiet of the forest had been neutral, a condition of the environment, something I was in. Now it felt provisional. The forest was quiet because nothing was happening, but the nothing was active, a deliberate absence, a pause. I was aware, in a way I hadn't been before, that the quiet could end, that it would end, that the only question was when and whether I would be looking when it did. I resumed taking compass bearings on the meadow. I don't know why. Some part of me needed the numbers, needed the structure of data, needed something I could write down and point to and say, this is what I measured, this is what changed, this is not my imagination. The bearings had not changed since my last measurement on August 2nd. 342.5, 351, 345, 347.5. Stable. I took them every morning for the next week, and they were the same every time. On August 20th, I noticed something about the meadow that had nothing to do with the bearings. The grass was dying. This was expected. It was late August in a drought year, and meadow grasses dry out and turn brown as summer progresses. But the pattern of the dying was unusual. The brown was spreading from the edges inward, from the tree line toward the center, as if the meadow were shrinking, as if the forest were claiming it from the outside in. The green grass in the center was a smaller and smaller island each day, retreating from the advancing brown ring that surrounded it. I know this is how grass dies. I know that the edges of a meadow, where the trees shade the ground and the root systems compete for water, dry out faster than the center. But knowing this and watching it happen slowly, day by day, while also holding in my mind the question of whether the tree line itself was advancing, these two pieces of information sat next to each other in my thoughts and produced a feeling that I can only describe as geometric unease. Everything was converging inward. The meadow's green center was shrinking. The tree line might be closing in. The anomalous motion in the northeast had been moving toward the tower. All the vectors pointed inward, toward the center, toward me. I recognized this thought pattern as potentially paranoid and tried to set it aside. I reminded myself that I was the center of every vector because I was the observer, and all observations radiate outward from the observer's position. Of course, everything seemed to converge on me. That was a function of perspective, not of reality. The meadow was not closing in. The forest was not advancing. I was a tired person in a tower in the heat of August, and I was making patterns from noise. On August 22nd, Davis didn't come on the radio for our usual evening conversation. I called him on the mutual aid frequency at our usual time and got no response. I tried again an hour later. Nothing. I tried on the main dispatch frequency and asked if anyone had heard from the Baker Ridge lookout, and the dispatcher said that Baker Ridge was offline for scheduled maintenance and would be back up in a few days. I asked about Davis specifically, and the dispatcher said he didn't have that information and suggested I try again later. This was the moment I realized the dispatcher had said Baker Ridge. Davis was not at Baker Ridge. Davis was at a different tower, one whose name I couldn't remember just then. But I knew it wasn't Baker Ridge because Baker Ridge was 40 miles to my south, and Davis had described his tower as being to my southeast. And the distances he'd described for various landmarks didn't match the Baker Ridge location. I was almost certain of this, but I couldn't remember the name of Davis's tower, and I couldn't remember whether he had ever actually said the name of his tower. And as I sat there trying to recall, I realized that I also couldn't remember Davis's first name, or whether Davis was his first name, or his last name, or whether he had ever told me. I had been talking to this man for weeks. We had shared stories and jokes and the small, intimate details of daily life that people exchange when they are both lonely and far apart, and I could not remember basic facts about him, his tower, his name, where exactly he was. I could remember the content of our conversations, but not the identifying information that would place him in the real world. He existed in my memory as a voice and a collection of anecdotes, disconnected from geography. This bothered me more than anything else that had happened, more than the meadow bearings or the log discrepancies or the moving trees. Those were external phenomena that might or might not be real. This was a failure of my own mind, a gap in the architecture of my memory that I couldn't explain and couldn't fill. I turned on the radio and called on the mutual aid frequency. "This is Desolation Peak Lookout. Any station, please confirm the name and location of the lookout southeast of Desolation Peak." I waited. Static, the low hiss of the channel. Then a voice I didn't recognize said, "Desolation, this is dispatch. Say again your request." I repeated it. There was a pause, and then the voice said, "Desolation. We show no staffed lookout to your southeast. The nearest active tower southeast of your position is Baker Ridge." Then silence. I sat with the radio in my hand and looked out the window toward the southeast, where the forest stretched away in undifferentiated green to the ridgeline. I had been talking to someone for weeks. I had heard his voice. He had told me about a bear and an elk herd and a fire he'd spotted the previous summer. He had been real, but the district had no record of a lookout in the direction I'd indicated, and the only tower they could suggest was one whose name had already appeared in my story in ways that felt wrong. I put the radio down. I went out on the catwalk and looked at the forest and tried to feel the solidity of the railing under my hands and the boards under my feet and the wind on my face. Real things, tangible things. I watched the last light fade and the forest darken and the stars emerge, and I told myself that there was an explanation for all of this that did not require the world to be other than what it appeared. But I no longer quite believed myself. The final week of August. The heat broke on the 24th, a cold front moving in from the Pacific, dropping the temperature 20 degrees overnight and bringing high clouds and a dampness in the air that I had almost forgotten existed. The fire danger eased. My scanning frequency returned to normal. The rhythms of the job reasserted themselves, and I settled into them with a gratitude that had a desperate quality to it. I wanted the routine. I needed the routine. The routine was the structure that kept me from following my thoughts to places they shouldn't go. I took my meadow bearings every morning. They were stable. 342.5, 351, 345, 347.5. The same numbers every day. I took them and recorded them and felt a small relief each time and didn't think about what it would mean if they changed again. On August 27th, I found something in my official log that I hadn't written. Not a weather observation or a fire report, but a single line at the bottom of the day's page, in handwriting that was similar to mine, but not identical. The letters were slightly more compressed, the slant slightly different. It said, "Wind steady all day. No anomalies observed." I stared at it for a long time. Then I went back through the logbook, page by page, looking for other entries that weren't mine. I found 3. All were brief, 1 or 2 lines, all in the same compressed handwriting. They were all innocuous observations, notes about weather or visibility, the kinds of things I wrote every day. But I hadn't written them. I was sure of it, fairly sure. The problem was that the handwriting was close enough to mine that I couldn't be absolutely certain it wasn't mine in a moment of distraction. My pen held at a slightly different angle, my hand tired, my attention elsewhere. I put the logbook down and walked to the window and looked out at the forest. The cloud cover was low, obscuring the higher ridges, and the trees below had a muted quality in the gray light, darker and less distinct than on clear days. The meadow was a dull brown now, the last of the green finally gone. The tree line around it was a hard, dark edge against the dead grass. I picked up the fire finder and took the meadow bearings. North end, 343. I stopped, looked again. 343, not 342.5. I took it again. 343. The north end had moved another half degree to the east. I took the remaining bearings. South end, 351. East edge, 345, west edge 347, not 47.5, 47. The west edge had also shifted half a degree to the east. Both edges were closing in. The meadow was narrower by half a degree on each side, which translated to maybe 7 yards total, maybe 3.5 on each side. I sat down and looked at my chart and added the new numbers. The trend was unmistakable now, not large, not dramatic, but consistent. The tree line was closing in on the meadow, slowly, incrementally, at a rate that could only be detected by careful measurement over weeks. If I hadn't been tracking it, I never would have noticed. The change was too small to see. But the trees can't move. I wrote that in my journal. The trees can't move. I looked at the sentence and thought about what else I had written and crossed out, and I left it there. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair by the fire finder in the dark and looked out at the forest, which was invisible except as a darker darkness below the cloud-covered sky. No stars, no moon, just the blackness of the canopy and the faint gray of the overcast above it. The wind was light but steady, and the tower swayed, and the forest made its sound. And I sat and listened and watched and waited for something I couldn't name. At some point during the night, I became aware that the sound of the forest had changed. The change was subtle, a gradual shift in the character of the rushing that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been listening so intently. The sound of wind in trees is produced by the movement of leaves and branches. It has a frequency and a texture that depends on the species of tree, the wind speed, and the distance. What I was hearing now sounded closer, not louder exactly, but more present, more detailed, as if the trees that were producing the sound were nearer to the tower than they had been before. I could hear individual branches in the mix, specific creaks and scrapes and rustles that I would normally only hear from the closest trees, the ones right at the edge of the ridge below the tower. But these sounds seemed to come from all directions, as if the forest had drawn closer in a ring while I sat in the dark. I did not look out the window. I sat in the chair and listened and did not look. The instruction in the handbook said to close my eyes if the trees started moving, but my eyes were useless in the dark anyway. What I needed to close were my ears, and I couldn't do that. The sounds continued until just before dawn. As the sky began to lighten, they receded like a tide going out, the detailed individual sounds fading back into the general wash of the canopy, the sense of proximity dissolving into the ordinary acoustics of distance. When the light was strong enough to see, I went to the window and looked. The forest was where it had been. The tree line was at its usual distance. The meadow was there, brown and still. Everything was normal. I took the compass bearings. They were the same as the day before. 343, 351, 345, 347. No change from the night before. Whatever I had heard, it had left no measurable evidence. I made my 0600 observation and radioed it in. The dispatcher acknowledged. I asked, on impulse, for a radio check with all active lookout towers in the district. The dispatcher said he'd pass along the request. Over the next half hour, 3 towers checked in. None of them were Davis. None of them were at a location southeast of me. I acknowledged each one and thanked dispatch and turned the radio off. September arrived, and with it the knowledge that my time on the tower was ending. My contract ran through September 7th, a week. 7 more days of observations and scans, and the long hours of watching, and the longer hours of not watching. I should have felt relief. I think I was supposed to feel relief. What I felt instead was something like the opposite, a deepening reluctance to leave that was tangled up with a deepening desire to go. Both feelings were strong and genuine and contradictory, and I sat with them and didn't try to resolve them. The weather turned cooler. Morning temperatures dropped into the 30s, and the first frost appeared on the catwalk railing, a thin white rime that melted by mid-morning. The fire danger dropped to moderate, then to low. The forest began to change color, just barely, the first faint yellowing of the larches on the high slopes, a shift so gradual that I couldn't say when it began, only that it was now undeniably present. I continued my routines. I took my bearings. The numbers held. I did my scans and saw no smoke. I wrote my logs and checked them carefully and found no entries I didn't remember writing. The days were calm and clear and quiet, and the forest behaved like a forest, and I began to wonder, genuinely and with something approaching hope, whether the strangeness of August had been nothing more than a combination of heat, isolation, and an overactive mind, whether I had simply spent too long alone, watching too carefully, finding meaning in randomness and pattern in noise, whether the whole thing was, in the end, just me. On September 4th, 3 days before my departure, I woke at dawn and made coffee, and went out on the catwalk and looked at the meadow, and knew immediately that something was wrong. The meadow was smaller, not by the fractional amounts I had been tracking with the compass bearings, smaller in a way that was visible to the naked eye. The tree line on the western edge was significantly closer to the center than it had been the day before. Not 3.5 yards, 20 or 30 yards at least. The meadow, which had been roughly 80 yards wide when I arrived, was now perhaps 40. The trees along its edges were dense and straight and close together, and they looked the same as the trees that had always been there. The same species, the same height, the same age. There were no young trees, no saplings, no sign of recent growth. The trees at the new edge of the meadow looked as if they had stood in that spot for 100 years. I went to the fire finder. My hands were steady. I took the bearings. North end, 345. South end, 349. East edge, 346. West edge, 346.5. The numbers bore no resemblance to what I had been tracking. The meadow had collapsed in on itself by several degrees of arc in every direction. The tree line had advanced by dozens of yards. Not overnight. It couldn't have happened overnight. Trees don't move. Trees don't move. But the numbers were in front of me, and the meadow was in front of me, and both were telling me the same thing. I looked at my chart, my weeks of data, the gradual half-degree shifts, the careful measurements, and I realized that the data didn't support what I was seeing. The data showed a slow, almost imperceptible closing. What I was looking at was something else entirely. The meadow had not gradually shrunk. It had jumped. Something had changed between yesterday and today that my incremental measurements could not account for, unless the incremental measurements were wrong, unless the numbers I had been recording were not the numbers I had actually measured, unless my logs, like the weather observations I didn't remember writing, contained information that had been placed there without my awareness. I thought about the entries in the compressed handwriting. I thought about the wind shift I didn't remember. I thought about Davis, who no one else could confirm existed. and I thought about how thoroughly, how completely, my record of events might diverge from the events themselves, and how I would have no way to know. I put the firefinder's sighting ring on the northeast sector. I looked. The forest was moving, not the wind-driven sway that I had spent months learning to read, not the gentle rhythmic wave of canopy responding to air currents. The trees were moving. The entire visible forest in the northeast sector was in motion, a slow, deliberate, unified drift that looked less like wind and more like migration. The canopy was shifting from right to left, from east to west, toward the tower. I could see individual tree crowns changing position relative to their neighbors, sliding past each other like objects on a conveyor belt. The motion was smooth and continuous and completely silent. There was no sound of roots tearing or trunks scraping or soil breaking. The trees were simply moving through the space they occupied, as if the ground were not a factor. I stepped back from the firefinder. I looked with my naked eyes. With my naked eyes I could see it too. The canopy was moving. The entire northeast quarter of the visible forest was flowing toward me like a slow, green tide. I should have been afraid. I think later I would understand that I was afraid, that the fear was present and enormous, but operating below the threshold of my conscious awareness, in the same deep architecture where the body decides to breathe and the heart decides to beat. In the moment, what I felt was clarity, a terrible, absolute clarity, the kind that comes when a thing you have been doubting is confirmed, and the doubt itself is removed, and you are left with only the thing. I looked south. The forest was moving there too, but more slowly, or from a greater distance, so the motion was less pronounced. I looked west. The meadow, what remained of it, was being consumed in real time. The tree line on every edge was advancing inward, the trees walking across the dead grass in their silent, rooted procession, closing the gap, filling the space. As I watched, the meadow shrank by another 10 yards on its western edge. The trees simply arrived where they hadn't been. Old trees, full-grown trees, as if they had always been there, and my memory of open space was the anomaly. I looked at all of it, and I understood something that I had been approaching for weeks without recognizing it. The instruction in the handbook was not about safety. It was not a warning to protect me from the forest. It was a warning to protect me from the knowledge of what the forest was doing. Because as long as I didn't see it, the contradiction didn't exist. The forest could move without my knowing, and my ignorance would preserve the coherent world in which trees stay where they are. The instruction was not close your eyes so you'll be safe. It was close your eyes so you won't have to know. And knowing was the problem, because now that I could see it, now that the motion was confirmed and undeniable and visible to my naked eye, I could not unlearn what it meant. The forest had been moving the entire time, since before I arrived, since before the person who wrote the note in the handbook arrived. The trees moved, and they had always moved, and every lookout who had sat in this tower and stared at this forest had eventually noticed, and the only question was what you did when you finally saw it. I closed my eyes. I stood in the middle of the cab with my eyes closed, and I listened to the silence of the moving forest, and I breathed. I kept them closed for a long time. I don't know how long. The tower swayed in the wind. The firefinder's brass gleamed in the sun that came through the glass. My coffee grew cold on the desk. I stood there and kept my eyes closed and did not look. When I opened them, the forest was still. The canopy was motionless except for the ordinary wind, a light breeze from the west that produced the usual gentle sway in the treetops. The meadow was there, brown and oblong, visible through the western window. The tree lines were sharp and dark and stationary. Everything looked the way it had looked for months, normal, ordinary. A forest in early September, cooling toward autumn. I went to the fire finder and took the meadow bearings. North end, 342. South end, 351. East edge, 345. West edge, 348. The original numbers. The first numbers I had ever recorded. The meadow was back to its full width, 80 yards. The tree line was where it had been in June. I looked at my journal. I turned to the page where I had recorded the morning's alarming bearings, the 345 and 349 and the rest. The numbers that proved the meadow had shrunk. The page was blank, not erased, not crossed out, blank. I flipped back through the journal, looking for my chart, my weeks of data, the careful tracking of half-degree shifts. The pages were there, but the writing on them was different. My charts were gone. My bearings were gone. In their place were ordinary journal entries, descriptions of sunsets and weather and birds. The kind of thing I had also been writing, but that now seemed to be the only thing I had written, as if the measurements had never happened. I checked the official log. The compressed handwriting entries were gone. Every entry was in my hand. The log was clean and consistent and unremarkable. I sat down and held the logbook in my lap and looked at it and understood that the record had changed, or that the record had always been this way, and my memory of a different record was false, and that I had no way to determine which of these was true. The forest was where it had always been. My logs said what they had always said. The handbook still had its note on the back cover, faint and carefully traced, but everything else in my experience of the past 2 months was now open to question. Had the trees moved? My memory said yes. My record said nothing had happened. Had Davis existed? My memory said yes. The district had no record. Had I spent weeks taking compass bearings on a meadow? My memory said yes. My journal said I had been writing about birds. I sat with this for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the cab in its familiar arc. The shadows of the window frames turned on the floor. The forest was quiet and green and still. I made my 1800 observation and radioed it in, and the dispatcher acknowledged, and everything was normal. That night I lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and tried to hold both versions of my experience in my mind simultaneously. The version where nothing unusual had happened, and the version where the forest moved. They couldn't coexist. One had to be true and the other false, or they were both true in some way I couldn't comprehend, or they were both false and the actual truth was something I hadn't considered. I turned these possibilities over and over, and none of them resolved, and eventually I fell asleep, and I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. The remaining 3 days passed without incident. I did my job. I took my observations. I scanned for smoke and found none. The forest was a forest. The meadow was a meadow. The tower was a tower. On September 7th, Carla drove up the ridge in the same truck and found me packed and waiting on the catwalk with my duffel and my books and the logbook and the handbook. She asked me how the season had been, and I said fine. She asked if I had had any problems, and I said no. She took the logbook and flipped through it and seemed satisfied. She took the handbook and put it in the glove compartment of the truck and I almost said something about the note on the back cover. And then I didn't, because what would I say? And what would it change? We drove down the ridge in the late morning light, and I watched the forest pass on either side of the road, and the trees were tall and still and permanent in the way that trees are. And I thought about how strange it was that something so large and so solid could also be so uncertain, could be both there and not there, depending on whether you were willing to look. Carla didn't talk much. We passed the meadow where the burnout had been, the charred trunks still standing in the new growth. I watched them pass and tried to remember whether they had been there on the drive in, and I thought they had, but I wasn't sure, and the not sureness had a different quality now than it had in June. In June, not being sure was the natural condition of a memory that hadn't thought to pay attention. Now, not being sure felt like a permanent state, a way of being, the only honest relationship to a world that might at any moment be other than it appears. We reached the district office in Winthrop in the early afternoon. I turned in my gear and signed the end-of-season paperwork and shook hands with the district ranger and walked to my car in the parking lot. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at the mountains to the west, where the forest climbed the slopes in a dark, unbroken mass, and I thought about the tower and the view and the glass room above the trees where I had spent 12 weeks watching. Then I started the car and drove away, and I did not look in the rear-view mirror, because I had learned in the end that there are things it is better not to confirm. The seeing is what changes you, not what you see, but the act of seeing it, the moment when perception and reality fail to agree, and you are forced to choose between your eyes and your sanity. The note in the handbook understood this. Whoever wrote it had been where I was. They had stood in the cab and watched the forest do something that forests don't do, and they had learned the same lesson I learned. Close your eyes. Not because the danger is in the forest, but because the danger is in knowing, in carrying the knowledge that the world is not fixed, that the ground you stand on moves when you're not watching, that the only thing keeping it still is your willingness not to look. Close your eyes and let it pass, and when you open them, everything will be where it should be, and you will almost believe it. Almost. I drive back to Bellingham. I unpack my things. I return to the life that I left, which is smaller and quieter than I remembered. I teach my classes. I grade my papers. I go to the grocery store and the coffee shop and the park by the bay where the gulls wheel and cry. I do ordinary things in ordinary places, and the world is stable and predictable and fixed. But sometimes in the evenings, when the light is going and the wind picks up and the trees along the street begin to sway, I notice something in the corner of my vision, a movement that doesn't match the wind, a tree that seems, for just a moment, to be slightly closer than it was the last time I looked, a gap in the canopy that wasn't there yesterday, and I feel the old uncertainty rise in me like a tide, and I close my eyes, and I breathe, and I wait, and when I open them, everything is where it should be. Everything is always where it should be. I took the job in early October, just before the season turned. The posting had been listed for 3 months on a federal hiring board, and I was the only applicant who met the qualifications and was willing to relocate. That should have told me something, but at the time I read it as luck. I'd spent the previous 2 years working wildfire suppression in eastern Oregon, long enough to know I wanted something slower, something where the days had a rhythm I could follow, A friend of mine who'd done seasonal work in Washington told me the Pacific Northwest districts were good for that. Quiet mostly. A lot of walking, a lot of silence. That sounded fine. The station was a single-story building at the end of a gravel road, about 40 minutes from the nearest town. It had a narrow porch, a radio room, a kitchen that smelled faintly of mildew, and 2 bunk rooms separated by a thin wall. There was a supply closet filled with orange flagging tape, a drawer of laminated trail maps, and a filing cabinet that stuck on the second drawer no matter how carefully you pulled it. The kind of place where everything had been touched by enough hands over the years that it all felt vaguely communal, like a library or a hostel. I was assigned the east bunk, which had a window that looked out into a wall of Douglas fir, so dense you couldn't see more than 30 feet before the trunks overlapped into darkness, even in daylight. My supervisor was a man named Dale, who had been with the district for over 20 years. He was patient in the way that people are patient when they've already explained things more times than they can remember and have made peace with explaining them again. During my first week, he walked me through the trail system using the largest of the laminated maps, which was pinned to a corkboard in the radio room. There were 7 maintained trails in our section, ranging from short interpretive loops near the trailhead parking areas to a 12-mile out and back that climbed to a ridge with partial views of the Cascades on clear days. Each trail was marked with colored blazes on trees and small numbered posts at intersections. My responsibilities were straightforward. Walk the trails on a rotating schedule, check the condition of the markers, note any damage from weather or fallen trees, speak with hikers when I encountered them, file a report at the end of the day, radio in if anything seemed urgent. Most of it wouldn't be urgent, Dale said. He spent 3 days walking with me, showing me the trailheads and the major junctions, pointing out where the soil got soft in the rain and where the canopy was thick enough that the GPS signal tended to drift. He was thorough. He told me which bridges needed inspecting after storms, where the elk liked to cross, and which sections of trail were prone to blowdowns in the fall. He told me that cell reception was non-existent past the first mile on most routes, and spotty even at the station. He showed me how to use the radio properly and tested me on the call signs. All of it was practical and clear. On the 3rd afternoon, we were walking back along the lower loop of Trail 4, a 2-mile path that circled through old-growth forest near the river. Dale had been quiet for a while, the way he often was on the trail, not withdrawn, but simply finished with what he needed to say. We passed a junction where Trail 4 met a short connector that led back to the main trailhead, and I noticed a narrow opening in the brush just beyond the junction post. It wasn't a trail exactly, but it looked like something had been a trail once. There was a faint line through the undergrowth, and the trees on either side seemed to stand a little farther apart than they did elsewhere, as if the canopy had once been trimmed back and had only partially reclaimed the space. I asked Dale about it. He glanced over without stopping, and then he said something I didn't fully process at the time. He said, "Don't follow the second trail." I waited for him to clarify. He didn't. He kept walking, and after a few seconds I followed. I assumed he meant it in a general sense, that there were old logging roads and decommissioned paths throughout the forest that weren't maintained, and that I should stick to the marked routes. That seemed reasonable. Every national forest I'd worked in had unofficial paths that went nowhere useful. Some were made by elk, some were made by hikers who thought they knew a shortcut, Some were old survey lines or timber roads that had been abandoned decades ago. You learned not to follow them because they wasted your time and could get you turned around. I filed it away as practical advice and didn't think about it again for several weeks. The first month was exactly what I'd hoped for. I settled into the rotation. Mondays I walked trails 1 and 2, the short interpretive loops near the main parking area. Tuesdays and Wednesdays I covered the longer routes, trails 3 through 5. Thursdays were for the backcountry sections, trails 6 and 7, which required an early start and sometimes a packed lunch. Fridays were for station work, filing reports, restocking supplies, cleaning equipment. Weekends were my own unless there was an emergency. The rhythm suited me. I woke early, ate breakfast in the small kitchen, packed my day bag, and walked. The trails were well maintained. The markers were easy to follow. The forest was enormous and quiet, and the quiet was the kind that filled your chest slowly, not silence exactly, because there was always something. The sound of water moving somewhere nearby, or wind passing through the upper canopy in a way that made a sound like breathing, or a bird calling from a distance that was hard to estimate. But it was quiet in the sense that there was no human noise, no engines, no voices most of the time. Just the forest doing what it had always done. I saw hikers occasionally, mostly on the shorter trails near the parking areas, couples with day packs, small groups with dogs. Once a woman hiking alone with trekking poles and a wide-brimmed hat who stopped me to ask how far it was to the river overlook. I told her about 1.5 miles, and she thanked me and continued on. Most interactions were like that, brief and pleasant. People were generally glad to see a ranger on the trail. It meant things were taken care of. I answered questions about trail conditions, pointed out a few birds when I could identify them, and reminded people to pack out their trash. Simple work, good work. By the end of October, the rain had settled in for good. Not heavy rain, usually, but the kind of persistent drizzle that hangs in the air like a mist and soaks through your jacket at the seams over the course of a few hours. The forest floor became soft. The trails turned muddy in places, and I spent more time noting drainage problems and flagging sections that needed maintenance. The undergrowth thickened with moisture. Ferns unfurled along the edges of every path, and the moss on the trees seemed to deepen in color until the whole forest looked like it had been dipped in green ink. Visibility dropped. On some mornings, the fog was so dense that I couldn't see the trail markers until I was nearly on top of them, and even the trees seemed to appear only at the last moment, stepping out of the gray like figures arriving late. I started carrying a compass more deliberately. The GPS was unreliable under the canopy on the best of days, and in the rain, it was worse. I learned to rely on the physical markers, the numbered posts, the colored blazes, and the feel of the trail under my boots. After a while, I could tell which trail I was on by the texture of the ground alone. Trail 2 had a long section of exposed root. Trail 4 had a stretch of packed gravel near the river. Trail 6 climbed steadily for the first mile and then leveled out onto a kind of natural shelf where the ground was softer and the air smelled different, more like decay, like the slow, patient work of decomposition that goes on beneath the surface of every forest floor. It was on Trail 6 that I first noticed something I couldn't explain. I was about 2 miles in on a Thursday morning. The trail had been climbing gently through second-growth timber, the trees thinner and more uniform than the old-growth sections, with a denser understory of salal and Oregon grape. I'd checked 2 trail markers already and noted that one of them had a loose post that would need resetting. The fog was moderate, not the worst I'd seen, but enough to limit my line of sight to maybe 50 or 60 feet. I was walking steadily, not thinking about much, when I came to a junction I didn't recognize. I stopped. The trail split into 2 paths. The left path continued along the route I expected, climbing slightly and curving to the north. The right path went in roughly the same direction, but at a slightly different angle, maybe 10 or 15 degrees to the east. Both paths had the same general character, same width, same kind of dirt. The undergrowth on either side was similar, ferns and low shrubs, unremarkable, but the right path didn't appear on my map. I checked twice, unfolding the laminated sheet and holding it close to my face in the damp air, tracing the route with my finger. Trail 6 had no junction at this point. It continued as a single path for another mile before reaching a signed intersection with Trail 7. I stood there for a few minutes, looking at both paths. The left one was clearly the correct route. It matched my map, and when I looked at it, I could see a trail marker about 40 feet ahead, the orange diamond nailed to a tree at eye level. The right path had no marker that I could see, but that wasn't unusual in itself. Unmarked paths existed throughout the forest. What struck me was how similar the 2 paths looked. Not identical, but close enough that if I hadn't been paying attention, if I'd been walking with my head down or talking to someone, I might have taken the right path without realizing I'd made a choice at all. I took the left path. I noted the junction in my field report that evening and described it as a possible game trail or old spur. Dale read my reports, and he didn't comment on it. I assumed it was nothing. Over the next 2 weeks, I encountered 3 more junctions that weren't on my map. Each time the pattern was the same. A trail I knew well would split briefly into 2 similar paths, one of which matched the map and one of which didn't. The second path was always close in appearance to the first. Same width, same kind of ground, same general direction, but offset by a few degrees. The second path never had trail markers, but it also never looked abandoned. The ground was firm, as though it had been walked on. The edges were defined. It looked like a real trail, just not one that anyone had documented. I reported each one. Dale acknowledged the reports with a nod or a brief comment like "noted" or "I'll flag that for review." He didn't seem alarmed. He didn't seem particularly interested. I attributed this to experience. Dale had been in the forest for 20 years. He'd probably seen dozens of informal paths come and go as weather and animal activity reshuffled the undergrowth. But something about these paths bothered me in a way I found difficult to articulate, even to myself. It wasn't the paths themselves, it was the consistency of them. Every time I encountered a second path, it appeared at a point on the trail where the original route curved or shifted direction. It was always on the outside of the curve, as though the forest were offering an alternative line through the same general space. And the second path always looked slightly better than the first. Not dramatically, just slightly, a little drier, a little smoother, a little more direct, as if it had been designed to appeal to someone who was tired or distracted or simply following the path of least resistance. I started paying closer attention to the junctions. I brought a small roll of orange flagging tape and tied a strip around a branch near each one so I could find them again on subsequent patrols. This worked for the first 2. I flagged them on a Tuesday, and when I returned on Thursday, the tape was still there, faded slightly from the rain but visible. The junctions were unchanged. The third flag was gone when I returned. I looked carefully. The branch I'd tied it to was still there, a low-hanging limb of a young hemlock about waist height, but the tape was gone. No scrap of it remained. I considered the obvious explanations. An animal might have pulled it off. The wind might have taken it, though it had been tied tightly. A hiker might have removed it, thinking it was litter. Any of these was possible. I tied a new strip and continued my patrol. When I came back 2 days later, the second strip was also gone, and the junction itself had changed. Not dramatically. The second path was still there, branching off to the right at roughly the same angle, but it seemed wider than I remembered. The ferns along its edges had been pressed back, as though something had recently passed through, and the original trail, the left path, the one on my map, looked slightly less defined than before. The ground was softer. A few small branches had fallen across it. Nothing that would stop a hiker, but enough to make it look less inviting by comparison. I stood at that junction for a long time. The fog was thick that day, and the forest was almost completely silent. No wind, no birds, just the faint drip of water falling from one leaf to another, a sound so small and continuous that it barely registered as sound at all. I took out my compass and checked my bearing. The left path went north by northwest. The right path went north by north. The difference was maybe 10 degrees. On a map, and over the short distance these paths likely covered, before reconverging or petering out, 10 degrees meant almost nothing. You'd end up within shouting distance of the same point, but standing there, looking down two paths that disappeared into identical walls of fog, 10 degrees felt like a significant divergence. It felt like a choice with consequences I couldn't see. I took the left path again and wrote up the observation in my report. This time I was more detailed. I described the missing flagging tape, the apparent widening of the second path, the slight deterioration of the primary trail near the junction. Dale read the report and said nothing for a day. Then, on Friday afternoon, while I was cleaning mud off my boots on the porch, he came out and stood next to me for a minute without speaking. "What I told you the first week," he said, "about the second trail." I looked up. "Yeah," I said. "That wasn't general advice," he said. He was looking out at the tree line, not at me. His voice was the same as always, calm, unhurried, a little flat, like he was reading a weather report. "I mean it specifically," he said. "When you see a second path, don't take it, don't investigate it, don't flag it. Just walk the trail, and keep going." I asked him why. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Because they move." He went back inside after that. I heard him in the radio room, checking frequencies, running through the evening protocol. I finished cleaning my boots and sat on the porch for a while longer, watching the fog settle into the spaces between the trees. I wanted to dismiss what he'd said. I wanted to hear it as the kind of thing a long-tenured ranger says to a new hire, part superstition, part hazing, a story that gets passed down because the forest is big and quiet, and people need stories to fill the silence. But I thought about the missing tape. I thought about the way the junctions always appeared at curves in the trail, always offering a slightly better option, always leading in almost the same direction, but not quite. I stopped flagging the second paths. I stopped noting them in my reports. November was colder. The rain shifted between drizzle and hard, slanting downpours that stripped the last of the leaves from the alders and turned every drainage into a small creek. Hiker traffic dropped to almost nothing. Some weeks I didn't see a single person on the trails. The isolation deepened in a way I hadn't anticipated. At the station, I had my routines, my meals, my radio checks. But on the trail, hours would pass in which the only evidence of any other human being was the trail itself. A narrow line cut through an immensity of green and gray and silence that seemed to have no boundary. I noticed my sense of distance changing. Trails I'd walked dozens of times started to feel longer, not dramatically, 5 or 10 minutes longer. I timed myself on Trail 4 one afternoon and found that a section I'd previously covered in 22 minutes took 28. I attributed this to the mud, which was thicker now and slowed my pace. That explanation held for a while. But then I timed myself on Trail 2, the shortest loop, well-maintained, mostly gravel, barely affected by the rain, and it also took longer than it had in October. 3 minutes longer. I wrote it down in my personal notebook, not in an official report. The second paths continued to appear. I saw them on almost every patrol now, usually 1 or 2 per walk, always at curves, always slightly offset from the original trail. I followed Dale's advice and ignored them. I kept my eyes on the markers and my feet on the path I knew, but ignoring them required effort. They were always there at the edge of my vision, a second line through the trees, a gap in the undergrowth that looked like an invitation, and they were getting harder to distinguish from the real trails. In October, the difference had been clear. The second paths had no markers, and their surfaces were slightly different, a little too smooth, a little too even. By mid-November, some of them had what looked like trail markers. Not official ones with the orange diamond and the trail number, but blazes of a sort, cuts in the bark of trees that might have been made by a person, or might have been the result of weather and animal activity. I couldn't tell. The ambiguity was the worst part. I began to rely more heavily on my compass. Every time I reached a junction, I stopped, took a bearing, checked it against my map, and deliberately chose the path that matched. This slowed me down, but it gave me something I needed more than speed, which was certainty. Or something close to certainty, because even the compass readings started to feel less reliable. Not in any measurable way. The needle didn't spin or jump, but my confidence in my ability to read it correctly was eroding. I'd take a bearing and think, north-northwest, and then a minute later I'd wonder whether I'd read it right, whether the angle had been closer to north, whether my hand had been steady, whether the nearby mineral content in the soil could be affecting the reading. These doubts were small, individually, but they accumulated. By the end of November, I was checking my compass 4 or 5 times at each junction, comparing readings, averaging them in my head, trying to build a case for each choice from multiple pieces of evidence. The work of navigation, which had once been automatic, became deliberate and exhausting. One morning in early December, I was on Trail 3, a mid-length route that wound through a mixed forest of fir and cedar before crossing a small creek on a wooden footbridge. I'd walked it many times. I knew the footbridge was approximately 1.7 miles from the trailhead, positioned just after a long, gentle descent through a section of tall cedar with very little undergrowth. The ground in that section was covered in a thick layer of shed bark and needles, soft and quiet underfoot. Normally, I could see the creek before I reached the bridge, a line of lighter sky where the canopy thinned over the water. That morning I walked the descent. The cedars were there, the soft ground, the muted light filtering through the canopy. Everything was correct. But when I reached the bottom of the descent, there was no creek, no bridge. The trail continued on a level grade through more cedars, identical in character to the section I'd just walked, as though the descent had simply repeated itself in reverse, evening out the terrain without arriving anywhere. I stopped. I took out my map and checked it. I was on Trail 3. I'd entered at the correct trailhead. I'd passed the correct markers, numbers 17 through 21, each one in the expected position. But marker 22, which should have been just before the bridge, was not where it should have been. The trail ahead was markerless for as far as I could see, which was about 40 feet in the fog. I checked my compass. I was heading west-southwest, which was correct for this section of Trail 3. I checked the time. I'd been walking for 38 minutes, which was close to my usual pace for reaching the bridge, maybe a minute or two fast. Everything was consistent except the physical landscape in front of me. The creek and the bridge were simply not there. I stood still for several minutes, letting my breathing settle. The forest was quiet around me, the deep, textured quiet that I'd grown used to, water dripping, branches settling, the faint hiss of fog moving through needles. I considered my options. I could continue forward on the assumption that I'd misjudged my position and the bridge was still ahead. I could turn back, retrace my steps to the trailhead, and start over. Or I could accept that something was wrong and radio Dale for assistance. I chose to turn back. It felt like the responsible thing to do. I retraced my steps, walking slowly, checking each marker as I passed it. 21, 20, 19, 18, 17. They were all there, all in the correct order, all on the correct trees. I reached the trailhead in 26 minutes, which was about right for an uphill return. I stood at the trailhead sign and looked back down the trail. It looked perfectly normal. The opening in the trees, the gentle slope downward, the soft floor of needles and bark. Nothing about it suggested anything wrong. I walked it again. This time, the bridge was there. I reached it in 35 minutes, right on schedule. The creek was running high from the rain, brown and fast, and the bridge was slick with moisture. Marker 22 was on a cedar, just to the left of the bridge approach, exactly where it belonged. I crossed the bridge and stood on the other side, looking back. The trail behind me was Trail 3. The trail ahead of me was Trail 3. Everything matched. I didn't report this one. I didn't know how to write it up. What would I say? That the bridge had been missing and then it hadn't? That the trail had rearranged itself between two walks taken 30 minutes apart? There was no language in the reporting system for that. And there was a simpler explanation available, that I'd been tired or distracted, or that the fog had been thicker than I realized, and I'd simply missed a turn, wandered onto one of these second paths without noticing, and then corrected myself on the return. That was possible. It was even likely if I wanted it to be. But I kept thinking about the markers. I'd passed markers 17 through 21 in both directions, in the correct order. If I'd taken a wrong turn, the markers would have stopped or changed. They hadn't. They'd been consistent throughout, which meant either I'd been on Trail 3 the entire time and somehow missed the bridge, or the markers themselves had been present on a path that wasn't Trail 3 at all. I didn't follow that thought any further. Not then. December continued. The days were short. I was often on the trail before dawn and sometimes didn't return until after dark, navigating the last half-mile by headlamp. The forest at night was different from the forest during the day. Not more threatening exactly, but more present. During the day, the trees were scenery. At night, they were objects, close and solid, and occupying space in a way you had to negotiate. My headlamp beam reached maybe 20 feet, and beyond that was blackness, and the blackness was not empty. It was full of trees, thousands of them, standing in the dark the way they always stood, patient and enormous. And I moved through them like someone moving through a crowd of people who were all facing the other direction. I started noticing the second paths at night. They were harder to see, obviously, reduced to suggestions of openings at the edge of my headlamp beam, but they were there, and at night the difference between a second path and the real trail was even harder to judge. The beam of light was narrow and created its own distortions, exaggerating depth, flattening texture, turning every shadow into a possible opening. I walked more slowly. I checked my compass more frequently. I trusted the markers and nothing else. On December 14th, a hiker was reported overdue. A man in his 40s, experienced, hiking alone on Trail 5. He'd signed in at the trailhead register at 7:15 in the morning and hadn't signed out. His car was still in the parking area at 5 in the afternoon when I did my evening check. I radioed Dale. He contacted the county search and rescue coordinator, and by 7 that evening we had a plan in place for a morning search if the hiker didn't turn up overnight. He didn't turn up. The next morning, I was part of a 4-person team that walked Trail 5 from both ends, with 2 people starting at each trailhead and working toward the middle. The trail was 6 miles long, a there-and-back route that followed a ridgeline through the dense forest before dead-ending at a rock outcrop with views to the west. The terrain was straightforward, no river crossings, no significant elevation changes after the initial climb. The trail was well marked and well maintained. We searched for 2 days. We found no sign of the hiker, no gear, no footprints off trail, no disturbance of any kind. We brought in a dog team on the second day, and the dogs followed his scent from the trailhead to a point about 2.5 miles in, where Trail 5 passed through a section of particularly dense timber. The trees there grew close together, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so thick that very little rain reached the ground, and the trail surface was dry and covered in a fine layer of dust. The dogs tracked the scent to this section and then lost it, not gradually. The handler said they stopped as though the trail simply ended. One of the dogs sat down and looked back at her, the way they do when a trail goes cold. We searched the area around that point extensively. We found nothing. The undergrowth was undisturbed. The trees were unremarkable. The trail continued straight through the dense section for another 100 yards before emerging into more open forest. There was nowhere for a person to go except forward or back, and yet the scent trail ended. On the evening of the second day, as the search team was packing up to leave, I walked the section alone one more time. The light was fading. The forest was almost completely dark under the canopy, just enough gray in the sky above to silhouette the highest branches. I walked slowly with my headlamp on, scanning the edges of the trail. I found it about 50 feet past the point where the dogs had stopped. A second path. It was on the left side of the trail, angling off to the south-southwest, barely visible in the undergrowth. It was narrow, maybe 2 feet wide, and the ground was slightly depressed, as though it had been walked on, but not recently, or not often, or not by anything heavy. The vegetation on either side was intact. No broken branches, no scuff marks, just a line through the forest that looked like a trail, or like the memory of a trail, depending on how you held the light. I stood at its edge and pointed my headlamp down it. The beam penetrated about 15 feet before the path curved gently to the left and disappeared behind a curtain of low-hanging branches. The ground was covered in the same fine dust as the main trail. I couldn't tell if there were footprints. The light was wrong and the dust was uniform. I did not follow it. I went back to the station and sat in the radio room for a while, not doing anything. Dale was in his bunk. The search had been called off for the night, and the coordinator had said they'd reassess in the morning. The hiker's family had been notified. There was talk of expanding the search area, of bringing in a helicopter if the weather cleared. I thought about the second path. I thought about the hiker, somewhere in the forest or not in the forest at all. And I thought about what it would mean to follow a path that shouldn't exist in order to find someone who had disappeared from a path that should. The logic of it didn't hold. You couldn't search for someone by walking into the same problem that had taken them, but the alternative was worse, because the alternative was doing nothing and knowing that there was a door I hadn't opened. I didn't sleep well. I lay in my bunk and listened to the rain on the roof and thought about distances, about how a trail that should be 6 miles might be 6 miles one day and something else the next, about how a bridge could be there and then not be there and then be there again, about how the dogs had followed a scent to a point in the forest and then the scent had stopped, not faded, not scattered by wind, but stopped, as though the person had simply ceased to exist in that location or had stepped from one version of the trail to another. The hiker was never found. The search was suspended after 5 days. His car was towed from the parking area. A report was filed. The incident was classified as a missing person in a wilderness area, which is more common than most people realize. People go into forests and don't come out, and more often than not, there is no explanation. The forest is large, and the terrain is complex, and the margins for error are thin. A wrong turn, a fall, a medical event, any of these can end a hike in a way that leaves no trace. That's what I told myself. That's the explanation I wrote in my own report, and the one I repeated to the other rangers, and the one I offered to the hiker's family when they called the station 2 weeks later to ask if we'd found anything new. I believed it in the part of my mind that was responsible for filing reports and maintaining professionalism and getting up each morning to walk the trails. I did not believe it in the part of my mind that had stood at the edge of a second path at dusk and felt the air coming off it, cool and still, and carrying a smell I couldn't identify. Something like resin, but not quite. Something that was almost familiar, but displaced. Like a song played in the wrong key. January came. The forest was deep in winter. The trails were quiet. Most days I walked for 6 or 7 hours without seeing another person. The fog was constant now, never lifting fully, never thick enough to stop me, just present, a permanent condition, like living inside a cloud that had settled to the ground and forgotten how to rise. My world shrank to the width of the trail and the reach of my headlamp and the face of my compass and the intervals between markers. I became very precise. I counted my steps between junctions. I timed every section of every trail and recorded the results in my notebook. I compared times across days and weeks, looking for patterns, looking for the slow drift I was afraid of finding. The times were not consistent. Trail 2, the shortest loop, varied by as much as 4 minutes between walks. Trail 4 varied by 6. Trail 6, the longest route I walked regularly, varied by almost 11 minutes, and I could not account for the discrepancy through pace or conditions alone. The trails were changing length, or I was changing speed in ways I couldn't feel, or my sense of time was deteriorating. All three of these explanations frightened me, but the first one frightened me the most, because it meant the ground I was walking on was not stable. It meant the map was a picture of something that used to be true. I continued to see the second paths. They were everywhere now. Almost every trail had at least one junction that wasn't on the map, and some had 2 or 3. The second paths looked better and better. Their surfaces were firm and even. Their sight lines were clearer. On some mornings, standing at a junction in the fog, I had to look for the trail marker for a long time before I could be sure which path was which. The markers were the only thing I trusted, and even they had started to seem uncertain. Not wrong exactly, but less authoritative. A marker is a piece of metal nailed to a tree. It can be moved. It can be placed on a different tree by a different hand for a different purpose. I had no way of verifying that the markers I was following were the same markers that had been there when the trail was built. I had no way of verifying anything except by comparison with my own memory, and my memory was a record written on water. I thought about leaving. Not every day, but on the bad days. The days when the fog was thickest and the times were most inconsistent and the second paths seemed to be everywhere I looked. I thought about driving to town, calling the regional office, and resigning, going back to Eastern Oregon, or further, somewhere flat and treeless where I could see the horizon and know exactly where I stood. But I didn't leave, partly because the job was all I had, and partly because I was afraid that if I left, I would never know what was happening in the forest. And not knowing seemed worse than knowing, even if what I knew was something I couldn't explain. In late January, I decided to follow a second path. I didn't plan it far in advance. I woke up on a Tuesday morning and knew, with a kind of calm certainty that surprised me, that I was going to do it that day. I packed my usual bag: water, food, first aid kit, radio, compass, map, headlamp, notebook. I wore my rain jacket and my good boots and my watch. I did my radio check at 6:30. Dale was at the station. He asked me my route for the day, and I told him Trail 4, the loop by the river. He acknowledged it and signed off. I drove to the trailhead and started walking at 7:15. The fog was moderate. The trail was wet but firm. I passed markers 1 through 8 without incident, following the familiar path through a corridor of tall fir that opened periodically into small clearings where the sky was visible as a pale gray circle overhead. At marker 9, the trail curved to the right, heading north toward the river, and there, at the outside of the curve, was a second path. I'd seen this one before. It was one of the earliest ones I'd noticed back in October. It branched to the right at an angle of maybe 12 degrees, heading roughly north-northeast while the original trail went north. The ground on the second path was smooth and dry, sheltered by a thick canopy of cedar that arched overhead like the ceiling of a long, narrow room. The original trail was muddy, with standing water in the low spots. The contrast was stark. I stood at the junction and checked my compass. I checked my watch. It was 8:02. I wrote the time in my notebook. Then I took 4 steps, and I was on the second path. The first thing I noticed was the sound, or rather, the absence of a specific sound. The dripping had stopped. The forest around me was still wet. The moss still glistened. The bark of the cedars was still dark with moisture, but the constant, omnipresent sound of water falling from leaf to leaf, which had been the background of every walk I'd taken since October, was gone. The silence that replaced it was not empty. It had a quality I can only describe as attentive. It was the silence of a room that has just been entered. I walked. The path was well defined, easy to follow. The ground was firm and covered in a thin layer of cedar duff that muffled my footsteps. The trees on either side were large and evenly spaced, and the canopy above was continuous, filtering the gray daylight into a dim, even glow that cast no shadows. I could see about 60 feet ahead, which was better visibility than I'd had on the main trails in weeks. Everything was clear. Everything was still. I walked for 10 minutes. The path curved gently to the left, then straightened. I checked my compass. I was heading north. This was roughly the direction I'd expect if I were on Trail 4, which looped north toward the river before curving east and then south to return to the trailhead. The bearing was consistent. The pace was consistent. The path was consistent. The only thing that was different was the forest around me, which was quieter and stiller and more uniform than any section of Trail 4 I'd ever walked. After 15 minutes, I began to notice something else. The trail markers. There were markers on this path. They were not the orange diamonds of the official trail system. They were older-looking, smaller, round-headed nails driven into the trunks of trees at roughly eye level, each one wearing a faint residue of yellow paint that had mostly weathered away. They were spaced at irregular intervals, sometimes 50 feet apart, sometimes 100. They were not numbered. They had no text, but they were deliberate. Someone had placed them. I stopped at one and examined it closely. The nail was old, its head flattened and rusted. The paint around it was barely visible, a halo of dull yellow against the gray bark. The tree it was driven into was a western red cedar, at least 3 feet in diameter, old enough that the nail had been partially absorbed by the bark's growth. This moniker had been here for a long time, decades possibly. I continued walking. The path went on. 20 minutes, 25, 30. I checked my compass regularly. The bearing had shifted slightly to the northeast, but the change was gradual and could have been a natural curve in the path. I checked my watch. It was 8:37, which meant I'd been walking for 35 minutes. At my usual pace, that would put me about 1.5 miles from the junction. On Trail 4, 1.5 miles from Maraker. Or 9 would put me near the river, approaching the footbridge. I should have been hearing water. I heard nothing. The silence was the same, deep and attentive and close. The path continued through cedar forest that looked identical in every direction. The same large trees, the same dim light, the same soft ground. I was not lost. My compass was working. My pace was steady. But I was somewhere that my map could not describe, and the distance I'd walked did not correspond to any feature of the landscape I knew. At 40 minutes, I stopped and made a decision. I would walk for 10 more minutes, and then I would turn around. This was a reasonable protocol. I'd established my turnaround time before I started. I would honor it. I walked for 10 more minutes. The path continued. The forest continued. The yellow-painted nails appeared at their irregular intervals, each one a small mark of intention in the immensity of the trees. At the end of 10 minutes, I stopped. I checked my compass. I was heading east-northeast, which was further off the Trail 4 bearing than I'd expected. I checked my watch. It was 8:52. I turned around. The path behind me looked exactly as it had when I'd walked it. Same trees, same ground, same dim light. The only change was the direction of my travel, and with it, the orientation of the nails, which were now on my left instead of my right. I walked back the way I'd come, matching my pace, counting my steps. I was careful. I watched the path ahead and checked my compass every few minutes. The bearing was south-southwest, which was the reciprocal of the direction I'd been walking, exactly as it should have been. Everything was consistent. After 35 minutes of walking south-southwest, I should have reached the junction with Trail 4. I should have seen the curve in the original trail, the standing water in the muddy section, marker 9 on its post. I should have been back. I was not back. The path continued, identical to everything I'd already walked. Same cedars, same ground, same silence. The yellow nails continued to appear on the trees, though I couldn't tell if they were the same ones I'd passed earlier or different ones. There was no way to know. They all looked the same. I stopped. I checked my compass. South-southwest. Correct. I checked my watch. It was 9:29. I'd been walking for 37 minutes since my turnaround, 2 minutes longer than the outbound walk. That was within normal variation for pace on a return trip. But I should have reached the junction. The math was simple. I'd walked in one direction for 50 minutes and then walked back in the opposite direction for 37 minutes. Even accounting for pace variation, I should have been close. I should have been seeing familiar ground. I stood on the path and looked around. The forest was the same in every direction. The trees were the same. The light was the same. The silence was the same. I was standing in a place that had no distinguishing features, no landmarks, no variation of any kind. The path extended ahead of me and behind me into identical corridors of cedar that faded into identical walls of dim, gray-green light. I felt something then that I want to describe accurately, because it's important. I did not feel panic. I did not feel fear in the way you feel fear when something is chasing you or when you're in immediate danger. What I felt was a slow, spreading recognition that the assumptions I'd been operating under were wrong. The assumption that a path has two ends. The assumption that walking in one direction and then reversing will bring you back to where you started. The assumption that distance is consistent and that space is stable. These are not things you normally think about. They are so fundamental that they don't register as assumptions at all. They are just the way things work. But standing on that path in that forest, they stopped being the way things worked, and what replaced them was nothing. Not a new set of rules, just the absence of the old ones. I kept walking. There was nothing else to do. I maintained my south-southwest bearing and watched for the junction. I counted my steps. I timed myself. I looked for the yellow nails on the trees and tried to determine if I was passing the same ones twice, but they were too similar to tell apart. The forest gave me nothing to work with. It was a single room that went on in every direction, and I was walking through it in a straight line that somehow did not end. After another 20 minutes, I began to hear something. Faint at first, and then gradually louder. Water. Not the dripping of rain from leaves, but the sound of running water. A creek or a river, somewhere ahead. I walked toward it. The sound grew steadily, and after a few minutes I could tell it was coming from directly ahead, from the direction I was walking. The path began to change. The cedars thinned. The canopy opened slightly. The light shifted from dim gray-green to a brighter gray. The air was cooler. And then the path ended. I stepped out of the trees onto the bank of a creek. It was a small creek, maybe 8 feet across, running fast and brown with winter rain. A wooden footbridge crossed it, old planks on a simple frame, slick with moisture. On the far side of the bridge, a trail continued into the trees, and beside the trail, nailed to a cedar, was a marker, an orange diamond, number 22. I was on Trail 3. The bridge on Trail 3, the one I'd walked to dozens of times, the one that had disappeared and reappeared in December. But I'd started the day on Trail 4. I'd entered Trail 4 at the trailhead. I'd walked Trail 4 to Marker 9. I'd taken the second path from Trail 4. And now I was on Trail 3, at a point roughly 2 miles from a different trailhead, on a trail that didn't intersect with Trail 4 at any point according to the map. I crossed the bridge. I walked the rest of Trail 3 to its trailhead, checking every marker as I went. They were all correct, all in order. The trail was exactly as I remembered it. I emerged at the Trail 3 trailhead parking area, which was empty, and I stood there for a moment, breathing, looking at the gravel and the sign and the familiar shape of the information kiosk, and then I walked the road back to the Trail 4 parking area, a distance of about 1.5 miles on a paved forest road. My truck was where I'd left it. I drove back to the station. I went inside and sat in the radio room and looked at the map on the wall. Trail 3 and Trail 4 were drawn as separate routes in separate sections of the forest, their closest points about 3/4 of a mile apart, separated by dense timber and a shallow ravine. There was no connection between them. There was no path that led from one to the other, and yet I had walked from one to the other in less than an hour, through a forest that had no features and a silence that had no source, on a path that shouldn't exist, following markers left by someone I would never identify. I didn't tell Dale. I wrote my daily report and described a routine patrol of Trail 4 with no unusual observations. I ate dinner in the kitchen and went to bed early. I lay in my bunk and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain, and I thought about the yellow nails in the trees, driven into the bark by a hand that had been there before me, marking a path through a forest that was not the same forest I walked every day. Or that was the same forest, seen from a different angle, the way a hallway looks different depending on which end you enter from. The next morning I went back to work. I walked Trail 1. The markers were where they should have been. The distances were close to what I expected. I saw 2 hikers near the trailhead and gave them directions to the viewpoint. They thanked me and continued on. The fog was thick but not unusual. The forest was quiet. Nothing was wrong. But when I reached the first curve on Trail 1, I saw it, the second path, branching off to the right, smooth and dry and clear, heading in almost the same direction as the original, but at a slight angle, as if it were a draft of the same trail written by a slightly different hand. I didn't take it. I walked past it and continued on the marked route. It was still there when I came back. The months since then have been what I suppose you'd call normal, if you accept a version of normal That includes things you can't explain and have stopped trying to. I walk the trails. I check the markers. I file my reports. I interact with hikers when the season brings them. I do my job. But I no longer trust the map entirely, because I know now that the map describes one version of the forest and the forest contains others. I don't know how many. I don't know where they lead. I don't know if the hiker who disappeared on Trail 5 found one of the second paths and followed it, or if the second path found him. I don't know what the yellow nails mean, or who put them there, or how long ago. I don't know if the distances I measure are the distances that exist, or if the distance shift when I'm not measuring them, or if measurement itself is part of the problem. What I know is this. When I stand at a junction and I see two paths, and one of them is the path I know, and the other is the path I don't, the difference between them is smaller than it was when I arrived. Every week it's smaller. The second paths look more like the real paths. The real paths look more like the second paths. Someday, I think, I won't be able to tell them apart. I'll stand at a junction in the fog, and I'll look at two identical trails leading in two almost identical directions, and I'll choose one, and I'll walk it, and I'll check the markers and count my steps and note the time, and I'll arrive somewhere, and I won't know if it's where I meant to go. And the forest will be quiet, the way it's always quiet, with that patient, attentive silence that feels like being watched by something that doesn't need eyes. I still work here. I still walk the trails every day, and every day I come back. I'm almost certain I come back to the same place. I've been chewing on whether to write this down for about a year now. I'm still not sure it's a good idea. But my wife says I talk in my sleep, and lately I've been saying the kid's name, and she finally told me she can't keep pretending that's normal. So here it is. Call it a confession. Call it whatever you want. My name doesn't matter. I've been a search and rescue officer for 9 years out of the same district office, working a stretch of country called Greylock Forest Reserve. It's a big place. About 320,000 acres of pine and hemlock, old logging cuts grown back wrong. Fire roads the state stopped maintaining in the 70s. Ravines so deep the GPS just gives up and shows you a blank circle. We get fog up on the ridges that doesn't burn off until noon, sometimes not at all. Helicopters can't see through the canopy in half the search areas. Drones lose signal in the drainages. A lot of the work still gets done the old way. Boots, dogs, a compass, and people who know the ground. In 9 years, I've found a lot of things. I've found lost hikers who walked themselves in a slow spiral for 2 days because they kept favoring one leg. I've found a hunter sitting against a tree with his rifle across his lap, dead about 4 hours, looking like he was just resting. I've found a woman who didn't want to be found, sitting in a campsite she made out of trash bags, who screamed at us until her husband showed up and she went quiet. I've carried out kids with broken ankles. I've carried out parts of people too. That's the job. You get used to it or you leave. I'm telling you all this so you understand I'm not the kind of guy who jumps at sounds. I don't believe in skinwalkers. I don't watch the ghost shows. My idea of a scary night is a thunderstorm rolling in while we've got volunteers in the field with bad rain gear. But the Caleb Morris search was different. We found something out there. The official report doesn't mention it because the official report can't mention it. There's no box on the form for what we saw, and the people who know what really happened, we don't talk about it, except sometimes late at a bar when somebody's third drink in and they start asking questions they shouldn't. I'm going to try to tell it the way it happened. If parts sound stupid, that's because they were. We didn't know. Caleb Morris was 12 years old. His family came up from out of state for a long weekend at one of the developed campgrounds on the east side of the reserve. Nice family. Dad worked construction. Mom was a nurse. Younger sister, about 7. They had one of those big canvas tents and a little dog. I've looked at the photos enough times now that I could tell you what brand of cooler they had. He went missing on a Saturday afternoon, around 3. The story the parents gave was simple and the kind of thing that happens all the time. Caleb wanted to walk down to the creek behind the campsite to look for crayfish. Mom said, "Okay, stay where I can hear you." Dad was napping. Sister was playing cards with a cousin. About 40 minutes later, Mom realized she couldn't hear him anymore. She walked down to the creek. His shoes were on the bank. His little blue compass, the kind you get at a scout shop, was sitting on top of the shoes. No Caleb. They called us at 4:15. By 5 we had a command post set up in the campground parking lot. By 6 we had 3 K-9 teams, a couple dozen volunteers, 2 state troopers, and a full hasty search going on the obvious areas. The creek, the trail to the overlook, the access road, the closest fire road. That's the protocol with kids. You hit the high probability spots fast, because most missing kids aren't really missing. They're behind a log 50 yards from camp, asleep. Or they walked uphill because kids walk uphill, and they're sitting on a rock crying. You usually find them before dinner. We didn't find Caleb before dinner. My partner that day was Deputy Aaron Pike. Pike was 28, 4 years on the job, smart, good in the woods, kind of quiet. The kind of guy who actually reads the manuals. He'd been my regular partner for about 1.5 years. I liked him. I still like him, even though he won't take my calls anymore. Pike and I drew a sector on the southwest side, downstream of the campground, along a drainage we just call the Hollow on the radio. It's not on any map by that name. It's a long, twisty creek bed that runs between 2 ridges and eventually dumps into the river about 4 miles down. Old loggers used it as a skid road back when. There's still rusted cable in some of the trees down there if you look. We started in around 7, with maybe 1.5 hours of usable light left. The plan was a quick sweep down to the first fork and back, calling Caleb's name, looking for sign, standard stuff. The weather was getting on my nerves. There was a front pushing in from the northwest, and the forecast had it raining hard by midnight. Cold rain, 38 degrees. A 12-year-old in a t-shirt and shorts, no shoes. That's a hypothermia clock you don't want running. Pike kept checking his watch. About 40 minutes in, we found the first thing. Pike spotted it. He stopped on the trail and said, "Hey, look up." I looked up. There was a little blue compass hanging from a hemlock branch. Same kind you'd buy in a scout shop. Same kind Mom had described. It was about 8 feet off the ground. Now, a 12-year-old isn't putting something 8 feet up in a tree. He's not a tall kid either. The photos showed maybe 4'11", 5 foot. And the compass wasn't just resting on the branch. It was tied there, tied with fishing line. Clear monofilament, looked like maybe 12-pound test, wrapped neat around the branch in 3 turns, and finished with a knot I didn't recognize. Not a clinch knot, not a uni, something fussy. Pike said, "That's weird." I said, "Yeah." We took photos. We marked the GPS. I called it in to the command post, and the IC told me to bag it and continue the sweep. Standard. You don't want to disturb a scene more than you have to, but you also don't leave evidence in the rain. I cut the line and put the compass in a baggie. The fishing line came down with it. I kept thinking about that knot. There were no other campsites along that creek. The closest fishermen would have been a mile downstream, and they'd use braid, not mono. We kept going. The footprints showed up about 200 yards past the compass tree, on a soft patch of mud at the edge of the creek. Boot prints, Vibram tread, the right size for a kid. They matched what Mom said Caleb was wearing, except, of course, Mom said he'd left his shoes on the bank. So already that was wrong. But that wasn't the part that bothered me. The prints were spaced out about 6 feet apart. I want you to picture that. I'm 6'1". My normal stride is maybe 2.5 feet. If I'm running hard downhill, I might stretch to 4. 6 feet between prints, full foot strike each time, no scuff marks, no slide. A 12-year-old can't do that. A grown man can't really do that on flat ground, not for any distance, and these went on for about 30 yards before disappearing into leaf litter. Pike crouched down next to one and said, "That's not him." I said, "Somebody's messing with us." That was my first thought. Honestly, I figured we had a weirdo in the woods. It happens. You get the occasional creep who follows a search because he's into it. We had a guy a few years back who used to drive up from 2 counties over to volunteer on missing women cases. Turned out he had a record. People are people, even out here. So I called it in as possible interference at the scene, and command sent a trooper down to meet us at the next fire road crossing. We pushed on. The dogs were the next thing. I didn't see this part myself. It came over the radio. One of the K9 handlers, woman named Reyes, good handler, had her dog working a scent line that started at the campsite and went down into the hollow. The dog tracked clean for about a mile. Then they hit a dry creek bed, a little side channel that only runs in spring, and the dog stopped. Sat down, wouldn't cross. Reyes tried to coax him. He wouldn't go. She said on the radio, "He won't take it. He's refusing." Then the second team came up behind her with a different dog, fresh handler, and that dog wouldn't cross either. Started whining, started backing up. Reyes asked for a redirect. The IC put both teams on a different sector. Pike heard all that on his handset and looked at me. He said, "Dogs don't do that." I said, "Sometimes they do. Bear scat, mountain lion, something." He said, "2 dogs." I didn't answer. I was thinking about the fishing line and the 6-foot stride. The light was going. The sun behind the west ridge does this thing where it just drops out. You go from gold to gray to nothing in about 20 minutes. We had headlamps on. The fog was already pooling in the low spots, that wet hemlock smell, and the creek was loud enough that you had to raise your voice to be heard from 10 feet away. I want to say something here about the creek. When you spend a lot of time in the woods, you learn that running water plays tricks on your ears. It can sound like voices. It can sound like a door slamming or a phone ringing or a kid laughing. Every searcher I know has, at some point, stopped on a trail because they thought they heard somebody, and it turned out to be water on rocks. You learn to discount it. So when I first heard Caleb's voice, I discounted it. We were maybe 200 yards past the dry creek crossing, working downstream. I heard a kid say, "I'm down here." I stopped. I clicked my headlamp off, which is something you do when you want to listen, because the buzz of the LED actually messes with your hearing if you're paying attention. Pike stopped behind me. I said, "Did you hear that?" He said, "Hear what?" Then it came again. "I'm down here. Mom?" Pike heard it that time. I watched his face change. He keyed his radio and said, "Command, possible voice contact in the hollow, Sector 4, requesting backup our position." The IC came back and said, "Copy, Reyes is being redirected to you, ETA 20. I said into the radio, also requesting the mother stay at command post. Do not bring her down here until we have eyes on. Standard. You don't walk a parent into a scene before you know what the scene is. We started moving toward the voice. It was coming from the hollow below us, where the creek made a hard bend around a fallen hemlock. The kind of place a kid would actually go. Sheltered, dry under the log, easy to climb into. If I was 12 and lost and scared, I'd crawl under there. The voice kept calling, "Mom, Mom, I'm cold. Mom, I'm sorry." And then it said something that stopped me. It said, "I should have watched him better. I should have watched him better. Oh God, I should have watched him better." That wasn't a kid's line. That was a mother's line. And here's the part I didn't put in any report. About an hour before we'd started our sweep, I'd been at the command post getting coffee. Stale coffee, the kind that sits on the burner too long and tastes like a penny. Caleb's mom was sitting on the bumper of the ambulance with a blanket around her, and one of the female troopers had her arm around her, and I heard Mom say, just under her breath, almost like she was praying, "I should have watched him better." 3 times, just like that. There was no way Caleb heard her say that. He was already gone. He was already down here somewhere, and she said it at the command post, 2 miles up the road. I told Pike what I'd heard at the CP. I told him quiet, with my hand over my mic. He said, "Somebody's up at the CP feeding info down here. Somebody's screwing with us." I said, "Who? On what radio?" "We're on a closed channel." He didn't have an answer. We kept moving toward the voice. Slower now. I had my hand on my sidearm, which I want to say is not something I do casually. In 9 years I've drawn it twice, both times for bears. I don't like having it out. Pike had his flashlight up, the big one, the 8 cell, and he was sweeping the trees ahead of us in slow arcs. The voice changed as we got closer. It got quieter, less words, just little sounds. Hmm, 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 like somebody humming to themselves. Then the breathing. I want to describe this carefully because it's the thing I still hear. It sounded like 2 people breathing, not in unison. One was a slow breath, in and out, like a kid asleep. The other was faster, shallower, on a different rhythm. The 2 breaths overlapped each other. Sometimes they'd almost line up and then drift apart again. Pike said, "Is somebody else down there with him?" I said, "Maybe." We came up on the fallen hemlock from the uphill side. Pike's flashlight beam went over the top of the log and down into the hollow underneath, and we both saw it at the same time. There was a figure crouched under there, about the size of a kid, knees pulled up, back to us, wearing a yellow rain jacket, Caleb's rain jacket. We knew the jacket because Mom had given us a description and a photo. yellow with a navy stripe across the chest, REI brand, kids medium. The jacket was torn down the back seam. Pike went into rescue mode. He'd been trained for this exact situation 100 times. He said, "Caleb, hey buddy, my name's Aaron. I'm with Search and Rescue. Your mom sent us. You're okay now. Can you turn around for me?" The figure didn't move. Pike took a step closer. I put my hand on his arm, and he stopped. I don't know why I did that. Some part of me, the part that has been in the woods a long time, was telling me something was wrong about the proportions. The arms were too long. Even in the rain jacket, even bunched up, you could see the sleeves were full all the way down past where a kid's hands should have been. The arms went past the knees. And the hands, they were tucked underneath, but I could see the edge of one. Long fingers, too many knuckles, or the right number of knuckles, but spaced wrong. And the feet, bare feet, sticking out below the jacket. The feet were too long, easily 12 inches, maybe more, narrow, no real arch. And here's the detail I wrote down later because I wanted to remember it exactly. There was no clear heel. The foot just sort of tapered to a point at the back, like somebody had stretched a normal foot out at both ends. I'm looking at this for maybe 4 seconds. It feels like an hour. Then the thing turned its face toward us. It turned slow. Not the way a startled kid turns, more like the way a security camera pans, smooth, mechanical. And the face. I don't want to overdo this. I want to tell you what I actually saw. The face was almost right. From a distance in bad light, you'd call it a kid's face. The shape was right. The skin tone was close. But the eyes were too round, and they were fixed open, and they did not blink when Pike's flashlight went across them. I've seen a lot of faces in flashlight beams. People always blink. Even dead people sometimes seem to flinch from light. Just a muscle thing. This thing didn't. The pupils didn't change either. They stayed the same size in 8,000 lumens. The mouth was working a little, like it was practicing. It said, in a kid's voice, "Hi." Pike said, "Hey, hey, Caleb." It said, "Hi, hi, hi." 3 times, exactly the same intonation each time, like a recording. Then it said, in a different voice, I should have watched him better. That was Caleb's mom's voice. Not an imitation. Her voice. The exact rasp she had from crying. The exact way she dropped the end of the sentence. Pike took a step back. I heard him exhale. Then it said, in Pike's voice, "Command. Possible voice contact in the hollow." Pike stopped breathing for a second. I could hear him stop. Then it said, in my voice, "Sometimes they do. Bear scat, mountain lion, something." That was what I'd said to Pike 10 minutes ago about the dogs. We hadn't been on the radio when I said it. There was nobody around. The creek was loud. There was no way anything 10 feet away could have heard me, much less repeated it back. Then it said, in a voice I hadn't heard in 11 years, "You used to be afraid of the basement. That was my dad. My dad died in 2014, lung cancer. He used to tease me about being afraid of our basement when I was a kid, and he used those exact words. You used to be afraid of the basement." He'd say it when he wanted me to do something I didn't want to do. Go grab the Christmas decorations. Go get the toolbox. I've never told anybody that. Not Pike, not my wife, not anybody. The thing under the log smiled. I'm going to say it smiled, because that's the closest word. But the mouth didn't do it the way a face does it. The corners just moved, like somebody pulling on strings. It said, in my dad's voice, "Come closer. Come down here. I can't see you." Pike fired the flare. I didn't even see him pull it. I just heard the pop, and suddenly the whole hollow was lit up red. Flares are bright. They're meant to be seen from a helicopter at night. At 20 feet, in a tight hollow, it's like somebody opened a furnace. In that red light, I saw the thing under the log clearly for about half a second. And I'm not going to describe it more than I already have, because honestly, I only saw it for half a second, and the rest is my brain filling in. But I'll tell you what else I saw in that flare light, because that's the part I'm more sure of. I saw other shapes standing in the trees around us. Not close. Maybe 40, 50 feet out in a loose ring. 5 of them. Maybe 6. They were standing very still between the hemlock trunks, and they were wearing clothes. I could see colors. One had on a red windbreaker. One had on something plaid, like an old wool coat. One was wearing what looked like a girl's pink backpack on one shoulder. The pink had gone gray with weather. I knew that backpack. I'd seen it in a case file. A girl named Hannah, 8 years old, went missing in 2009 in a different sector of the reserve. Never found. Her family had given us the description of the bag. Pink with a cartoon horse on it. I grabbed Pike by his vest and I said, "Run." He didn't argue. We ran uphill the way we'd come, the flare still hissing behind us in the leaves. I don't remember most of that run. I remember branches hitting my face. I remember Pike falling once and me hauling him up by the back of his belt. I remember the radio squawking in my ear and not being able to answer it because I needed both hands. Behind us I heard my own voice, very calm, saying, "Run, Pike, run, Pike, run, Pike," on a loop, like a tape. We came out on the fire road about, 10 minutes later. The trooper was waiting there with his lights on. Reyes pulled up about a minute after that. We must have looked bad because the trooper put his hand on his sidearm and said, "Are you hit? Are you hit?" Pike was just shaking his head. He kept saying, "No, no, no." I had to lean against the truck for a minute. I told the trooper we'd had an encounter with an unidentified male in the hollow, possibly armed, and we needed a tactical response before we sent anybody else down there. That was the only thing I could think of that would get them to take it seriously without me sounding insane. They sent a team in within the hour. 4 guys, full kit, night vision. They went down to where the fallen hemlock was. They found nothing. No jacket, no figure, no footprints. The flare had burned out, and there was a black scorch mark on the leaves. That was it. They asked me where the other shapes had been. I walked them out to the spots, best I could remember. There was nothing there either. No prints, no fibers, no bent branches. Back at the command post, they pulled our body cam footage, both of ours. From the moment we got to the fallen hemlock until we came out on the fire road, both cameras showed nothing but static. White noise, 23 minutes of it. Before and after, the footage was clean. They pulled our GPS tracks. Both of our handhelds had been recording every few seconds, like they're supposed to. The tracks showed that during those same 23 minutes, we had walked a tight, almost perfect circle. Not down to the hollow, not back up to the fire road. A circle. About 60 feet across. 47 minutes of looping, even though our watches and the radio logs said 23. I can't explain that. I'm not going to try. Pike sat in the back of the ambulance for about an hour while they checked him over. He was uninjured. Vitals were a little high. He wasn't talking much. When I went over to him, he looked at me, and he said very quietly, "It only wears what it remembers." I said, "What?" He said, "It only wears what it remembers." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. He just kept saying it every few minutes, like he was trying to memorize it. By the time the EMT closed the doors, he'd said it maybe a dozen times. The search continued for 9 more days. We brought in more dogs. We brought in a state air unit with FLIR. We brought in cadaver dogs on day 5, which is the day you stop pretending. We never found Caleb. We never found any of his clothing other than the jacket he'd been wearing when he disappeared, which we never got back. We never found any sign of the figure under the log. The official report says Caleb Morris, age 12, disappeared from the Greylock Forest Reserve on a Saturday afternoon, presumed deceased, body not recovered. Suspected drowning or exposure. Case open but inactive. That's the report. After it got handed off, I started going through old files. I had access. I made up a reason. I told my supervisor I was working on a training packet for new searchers about the reserve's historical incidents. He said, "Sure, knock yourself out." I went back 40 years. There's a pattern. I want to be careful here because I'm not a statistician, and I know how easy it is to see patterns that aren't there. But every 7 or 8 years, going back at least to 1976, a child has disappeared in or near the hollow drainage. Not always 12. The youngest was 6, the oldest was 14. Different circumstances each time, different times of year, but the same general piece of ground. 5 cases. Hannah, 2009, the pink backpack. A boy named Devin, 2002. A girl named Maria, 1994. 2 brothers, 1986. That one was ruled an accident river. And a boy named Thomas, 1976, never found. The file is mostly handwritten. In 4 of the 5 files, there are searcher statements about hearing the missing person's voice from places where the voice could not have been. In 2 files, those statements are crossed out with pen. In one, the searcher who made the statement resigned within the year. In another, the searcher killed himself 18 months later. The 1976 file mentions a volunteer who walked off during a follow-up search in 1978 and was himself never found. I'm not telling you this to be dramatic. I'm telling you because once I saw it written down, I couldn't unsee it. I went back to the hollow. I went alone. That's against every protocol we have. I could have been fired. I told my wife I was going fishing. I drove up on a weekday in October, 3 months after Caleb disappeared, parked my truck at a fire road 2 ridges over so nobody would recognize it, and walked in. I brought a thermal camera, 3 sets of batteries because I'd learned, a flare gun with 6 flares, my shotgun loaded with slugs, and an old cassette tape recorder I'd found in my dad's stuff after he died. The tape recorder was a hunch. The body cams had failed. Digital had failed. I wanted something with moving parts. I want to say I had a plan. I didn't really. I just wanted to know if Caleb was still alive. I had this stupid, stubborn idea that we'd missed something, that he was down there somewhere, hurt, holed up. It's the thing that keeps you up at night in this job, the maybe. I got down to the fallen hemlock about an hour before sunset. Same hollow, same creak noise. I almost missed the nest. It was about 30 yards off the creek, behind a curtain of rhododendron, on a flat patch of dirt under an overhang of root. From the trail you couldn't see it. I saw it because the thermal camera caught a faint warm patch, and I went to check. It was a pile of clothing, folded clothes, sort of. I want to be clear that this wasn't a mess. It was arranged, layered, like somebody had built it on purpose. I recognized the pink backpack on top. Underneath, a red windbreaker. Under that, a plaid wool coat. A child's sneaker, a single one, no match. A rain hat. A small pair of jeans, folded. A scout shirt with a name patch I couldn't read because the thread was rotted. In the center of the pile, sitting upright on top of a folded yellow rain jacket, was Caleb's blue compass. The same one we'd cut down from the tree. The one that was supposed to be in an evidence locker at the district office. I know it was the same one because I'd scratched my initials and the case number into the back of the plastic with my pocket knife the night we logged it. Standard for me. The scratch was there. I stood there looking at the compass for what felt like a long time. The light was going. I had the tape recorder running in my chest pocket. I had the flare gun in my right hand and the shotgun across my back. Behind me, very close, somebody said my name. It was the dispatcher's voice. Sheila. She's been on the radio at our office for 16 years. I know her voice better than my own mother's. She said my name, and she said, "You need to come back to the road. We've got a situation at the trailhead." I didn't turn around. I said out loud, into the trees, "I'm not answering you." There was a pause. Then Pike's voice said, oh God, help me. Please, I'm hurt bad." It was perfect. The pitch, the little break at the end. I've heard Pike scared, and that was Pike scared. I almost turned. I want you to understand. I almost turned, even knowing. I said, "I'm not answering you." Then it tried something else. It said in Caleb's voice, soft, tired, "I'm here. I'm okay. I'm just down by the water. Mom's coming. Tell Mom I'm sorry." I felt my throat close up at that one, because I'd wanted that. I'd wanted that for 3 months, to be the guy who walked out with the kid. Then it did the thing that broke me a little. It used my voice, not imitating something I'd said, saying things I was thinking. I was standing there with my hand on the flare gun, and I was thinking, the compass first, then the pile, get downstream, don't answer. And the voice behind me, my own voice, calm, almost helpful, said, the compass first, then the pile, get downstream, don't answer. It said it about a half-second before I would have said it out loud if I'd been the kind of guy who talks to himself. I understood something then, standing in that hollow. I understood that this thing wasn't just out here taking kids. The kids were almost a side thing. What it wanted was the rest. The voices, the grief, the way a mother says I should have watched him better, the way a father teases his son about a basement. It was learning us. It had been learning us in this drainage for at least 50 years, probably longer, taking pieces of people and trying them on, getting better at it. The kids were how it practiced. I saw Caleb then. I don't know how to make this part believable, but I saw him. He was standing about 60 feet off, between 2 hemlocks, in the dim. He was wearing the same t-shirt and shorts he'd gone missing in. He wasn't bloody. He wasn't dirty. He was just standing there, very still. and his eyes were open, and he was looking right at me. Alive. I'm almost sure he was alive in some sense of the word. He didn't move his mouth, but I heard him whisper, like he was right next to my ear, "Don't let it hear you remember me." I want to say I was brave. I wasn't. I just did the next practical thing. I lifted my boot and I brought the heel down on the compass. The plastic cracked. I stomped again, harder, and the needle case popped out the side and the whole thing came apart. Then I stepped back, raised the flare gun, and put a flare straight into the middle of the clothing pile. It went up fast. Old fabric, dry under the overhang, 3 months of summer. The yellow rain jacket caught, and the flames went blue at the edges for a second from whatever the coating was. The pink backpack melted. The scout shirt curled. Behind me, a lot of voices started talking at once. Some were calm. Some were screaming. I heard my dad. I heard my wife, which scared me worst of all because I'd never heard her in there before, and I realized it had been listening to me for a while. Maybe through me, maybe just standing outside my house at night. I don't know. I don't want to know. I didn't answer any of them. I turned and I walked fast down the bank of the creek, and I stayed in the water. I stepped right in it, soaked my boots up to the knees. The water was cold enough that my legs went numb in about a minute. I kept walking, downstream, not running. Running gets you hurt in a creek bed at dusk. Something kept pace with me on the bank for a while. I won't say I saw it. I didn't look. I heard it. Long steps in the leaves. Sometimes a voice, very close to the water's edge, asking me a question. Asking if I was cold. Asking if I wanted to see my dad. Asking if Caleb could come with me. I didn't answer. About a mile down, the creek runs over a little, falls into a wider pool, and the trees open up, and you can see the river beyond. The footsteps stopped at the falls. The voices stopped. I walked another half-mile in the water before I let myself climb out. I got to my truck around midnight. I drove home. I didn't sleep. I did not listen to the tape in the recorder. I burned it in a fire pit in my backyard the next morning. I didn't even rewind it. I'm sorry if you wanted me to. I couldn't. That was 3 years ago. Pike transferred out about 6 months after the Caleb search. He's working a desk in another county now. We exchanged a few texts the first year. He stopped responding. The last thing he sent me was a picture of a cross-stitch his wife had made for their kitchen, some Bible verse, and underneath he wrote, "Doing okay." I think he is. I hope he is. I still work search and rescue. I still know the Hollow. We still get calls down there sometimes. Lost hunters mostly. I take those calls. I'm not going to be the guy who flinches. But I have one rule now, and I tell it to every new searcher I train, although I don't tell them why. The rule is this. If you're in the woods and a missing person calls your name, do not answer them until you can see their eyes, until you can see them blink, until you can see them breathe and the breathing matches the talking. If those things don't line up, you walk away. You don't apologize. You don't explain. You just go. Most of the new kids think it's a weird rule. They humor me. I'm telling you all this because I got a voicemail last week. Unknown number. No area code I recognized. 3 seconds long. I almost deleted it without listening. I'm glad I didn't. I'm also not glad I didn't. I don't know what I am. It was Caleb's voice. Older, maybe. Hard to tell from 3 seconds. He said very politely, like a kid talking to a teacher, "Officer, I found your compass. I don't own a compass. I've never owned one I cared about. The one in my truck is a freebie from a gear company. I've never tied my name to a compass in my life." I played the voicemail again, then a third time. The third time I put my good headphones on, the ones I use for editing reports, and I turned the volume up. There's another voice underneath Caleb's. It's very faint. You have to know to listen for it. It's saying one sentence on a loop behind his words. It's my voice. It's saying, "He remembers you now. He remembers you now. He remembers you now." I haven't deleted the voicemail. I'm not going to. I'm also not going to play it again. I've put my phone in a drawer in the garage, and I'm using an old one for now. I don't know what to do with any of this. I'm not going back into the hollow. I'm not going to call Pike. I'm not going to file anything, because there's nothing to file. The official report says Caleb Morris was never found, and that's the truth as far as paperwork goes. If you're a searcher and you're listening to this, and you work a place that has a drainage like ours, I just want you to remember the rule. See the eyes. See the breathing. Don't answer until you're sure. And if you ever find a small blue compass tied up in a tree with fishing line 8 feet off the ground, in a place where no kid could have put it, don't cut it down. Just walk away and don't look back, and for God's sake, don't say your own name out loud on the way out. That's all I've got. Thanks for listening. I've been a forest ranger in the same district for 16 years. Most of what I do is boring. I check permits. I clean fire rings. I write up people who carve their initials into bridge rails. I know the radio chatter at our station, the way other people know their kids' voices. I'm telling you that, so you understand I'm not the kind of guy who gets spooked. But there's a reason we don't answer voices after dark out here. I'm going to tell you about it, and you can do whatever you want with it. I work out of the Ash Hollow district, on the west side of a place called the Cold River National Forest. It's about 400,000 acres of mixed hardwood and pine, with a couple of long ridges running north to south, a lot of old logging cuts, and one big drainage in the middle called the Cold River itself. The river isn't cold most of the year. Somebody named it in 1840, and it stuck. There are 3 developed campgrounds, maybe 60 miles of marked trail, and a whole lot of country that nobody goes into because there's no reason to. We have 5 permanent rangers and a rotating crew of seasonals. In the summer, we add SAR volunteers from 2 counties. Our station is a brown wooden building from the 60s with bad insulation and one good coffee maker that somebody's wife donated. The coffee maker is the most important piece of equipment we own. I'm not joking. When it broke in 2019, 2 guys almost quit. The thing I'm going to tell you started in October a few years back. I'm not going to say the exact year. You'll understand why in a minute. I was on a shift with a ranger named Del Harkin. Del was about my age, maybe a year older. Retired Army, divorced twice. The kind of guy who would sit in the truck eating sunflower seeds and not say a word for an hour, and you'd still feel comfortable. He'd been at Cold River for about 11 years when this happened. Solid guy. I want to make that clear before I tell you what he did at the end. We got a call around 4 in the afternoon from dispatch. A woman had come into the visitor center to report her husband overdue from a day hike. His name was Robert Lindgren, 62. retired chemistry teacher. He'd driven down from up north for a long weekend, told his wife he was going to do the saddle loop, and was supposed to be back at the cabin by 2. It was 4:30 when she walked into the visitor center. He was about 2.5 hours late. That's not unusual. Saddle loop is 6 miles, decent elevation, and a lot of older folks underestimate it. Most of the time, the overdue hiker is sitting on a log a mile from the trailhead with a sore knee, trying to figure out how to text. We took the report, got the truck description, got his clothing description. Tan jacket, gray pants, blue ball cap with a fish on it. He had a small day pack, water, a sandwich, and an old Garmin GPS that his wife said he used for geocaching. No medical issues to speak of, except his hearing wasn't great. She gave us a photo on her phone. We took a picture of the photo. That's how we did it. Dell and I drove out to the Saddle Loop trailhead. His Subaru was in the lot, alone. Engine cold. We did the usual. We hit the trail and started up, calling his name every few minutes, blowing the whistle, checking the obvious places. The Saddle Loop is a balloon trail. You walk in about a half mile, then it splits and goes around a little knob. Most people go counterclockwise because that puts the climb first. We went counterclockwise too. We found his hat at the high point of the loop, around mile 2.5. Now, the hat itself wasn't weird. People drop hats. The blue ball cap with the fish on it was sitting upside down on top of a trail marker post, not on the ground. On top of the post. The post was about 4.5 feet high. Somebody had put it there. Dell looked at me and said, "Well, he went past here." I said, "Yeah, but he didn't leave the hat like that." Dell said, "No, he didn't." We bagged the hat. We kept walking. We finished the loop. No, Robert. We drove back to the station, called it in as a confirmed missing, and started the protocol. By 7, we had a command post going at the trailhead, a couple of volunteers showing up, 2 K9 teams en route, and the wife sitting in the front of our truck with a thermos somebody had handed her. She kept saying, "He's done this trail before, he's done this trail before," which made me feel a little better, because that meant he probably wasn't completely off the route. Dark came in fast that night. October dark in Cold River is a real thing. The sun drops behind the west ridge, and there's about 20 minutes of bluish light, and then it's just black. The fog comes in along the creeks. The temperature falls maybe 15 degrees in an hour. By 8 o'clock we were running with headlamps, and the air had that wet leaf smell. I was working a sector along the east side of the loop with Dell and a volunteer named Caitlin. Caitlin was new, maybe her 3rd or 4th search. Quiet kid, did everything by the book. We were maybe 40 minutes in when I heard the first one. Somebody up the ridge said, "Hello?" I stopped. I clicked my headlamp off, because that's what you do when you want to listen. Dell did the same. Caitlin was a little behind us, and she stopped too. It came again. "Hello? Anybody?" It was a man's voice, older, thin, sounded like it was coming from up and to our right, maybe 300 yards uphill, in the direction of a little side drainage that doesn't have a trail through it. Dell keyed his radio. He said, "Command, possible voice contact upslope of our position. We're going to investigate." The IC came back. "Copy." We started up. It's steep there, lots of loose rock, and you have to grab roots to get up it in the dark. Caitlin was breathing hard behind me. About halfway up, The voice came again, but it had moved. It was off to our left now, further away, but lower in elevation, like the guy had walked downhill and across the slope in the time it took us to climb 50 feet. Del stopped. He said, "That's not right." I said, "Sound bounces in here." He said, "Not like that." He was correct. I knew he was correct, but I didn't want to know. We changed direction. We started traversing toward the new sound. The voice kept calling, "Hello? Hello?" It had a little hitch in it, the way somebody sounds when they're cold and they've been walking too long. The kind of voice you'd hear and immediately think, "That's our guy. That's a tired old man." We got within what I estimated was 100 yards when the voice changed. It said, "I'm over here. I'm right over here." That was Del's voice. Not similar. His. The exact way he says "over here" when he's on the radio, with the little stress on the "here." Del stood completely still. His face went the color of paper. I could see it under his headlamp. Caitlin said, "Was that you?" Del didn't answer. I said into the radio, "Command, hold all units. We've got something off down here." The IC came back. "Off how?" I said, "Just hold everybody. Stand by." The voice up the slope said in Del's voice again, "Command, hold all units." It said it about a half-second after I said it on the radio, maybe less, like it was repeating a transmission it had just heard, except nobody else on the radio sounded surprised. The voice wasn't coming over the radio. It was coming through the trees. Caitlin started to say something and Del put his hand up. He didn't look at her. He was looking up the slope, headlamp off, just listening. After a minute, the voice changed again. It said, in the old man's voice, the missing hiker voice, "Please, please, I'm so cold." That hit me in the gut. I'm not going to lie, because that was a real thing somebody might say. I've heard people say it. I've heard it on real searches. And every part of my training said, "Go, go now, get up there." Del said very quietly, "We're not going up there." I said, "Del." He said, "Listen to me. We're not going up there. That's not him." I want you to understand something about Del. He'd been Army. He'd done 2 tours in places I'm not going to name. He was the steadiest guy I'd ever worked with. I'd seen him pull a kid out of a flooded culvert with one arm. I had never, in 11 years, seen him refuse to go toward a voice. Caitlin said, "What do we do?" Del said, "We go back down. We tell the IC we need to pull everybody off this slope until daylight." I said, "Del, there is a 62-year-old man up there." He looked at me. He said, "No, there isn't. Not up that way. Whoever is up there is not him." The voice up the hill said, in my voice this time, "There is a 62-year-old man up there." Caitlin made a sound. Just a little sound. Half a laugh, half something else. The kind of sound you make when your brain is trying to file something it doesn't have a folder for. We went back down. I want to be clear about what happened next, because it matters. When we got back to the command post, Del and I had a quiet, very ugly argument with the IC. The IC was a guy named Bill Reaver, a county SAR coordinator who I respected. Bill heard us out. He looked at Del for a long time. Then he said, "All right." We pull off the east slope until first light. We hold position on the loop trail itself. Nobody goes up that drainage tonight. The wife was sitting 20 feet away. She heard parts of it. She started crying, the quiet kind, and the female trooper who was with her put an arm around her shoulders. I went over and I told her, "Ma'am, we're going to find him at first light. We just need a little daylight to do it safe. The terrain up there is bad in the dark," which was true mostly. I felt like a liar saying it, but I said it. We held position. We sat in the trucks. Some of the volunteers grumbled. One of them, an older guy named Pete, asked me what was going on, and I just said we'd had a bad sound contact and the IC wanted to wait for light. Pete had been on enough searches to know not to push. He nodded and went back to his truck and drank coffee. About 1 in the morning, the radio in our truck made a sound I'd never heard a radio make before. It wasn't a transmission. It was a kind of slow scratching, like somebody dragging a fingernail across the speaker mesh. Very slow, maybe one stroke every 3 seconds. It went on for about 30 seconds. Then it stopped. Then a voice said, very softly, "Hello? Anybody?" The same voice from the slope. Dell reached over and turned the radio off. Just clicked the knob. I looked at him and he shook his head. He said, "We'll use my handset. The truck radio stays off." I didn't argue. At first light, we went up. Bill Reaver came with us, plus a K9 handler named Reyes and her dog. The dog was named Boomer. Good dog. Worked a lot of cases. Boomer wouldn't go up the slope. He sat down at the bottom and looked up the hill and would not move. Reyes worked him for 10 minutes. Treats, commands, the whole thing. He was not aggressive. He wasn't scared in the way dogs sometimes get. He was just refusing. Reyes finally said, "I'm sorry, he's done. We can try a different line." We went up without the dog. Me, Dell, Bill, and a younger ranger named Hicks, who'd driven over from another district to help. We found Robert Lindgren about 600 feet up the slope, sitting against a tree. He was alive. That was the first thing. He looked up when we came around the tree, and he raised one hand a little, and he said, "Hi, fellas." He had a sprained ankle, and he was cold, and his pants were torn at one knee. His pack was next to him. His water bottle was empty. His Garmin was in his hand, switched on. He was about 50 yards uphill from a little game trail that would have taken him back to the loop in maybe 15 minutes if he'd known to follow it. Bill went straight into rescue mode. "Sir, my name's Bill. We're going to get you out of here. How long you been here?" Robert said, "All night, I think. I sat down because of my ankle, and then I got turned around. I crouched down to look at the ankle. I said, 'Sir, did you call for us last night? You hear us calling for you?' He looked at me, kind of confused, and he said, 'No, I didn't hear anything. I tried to yell once and I couldn't. My throat was too dry.' Dell was standing about 10 feet behind me. I felt him not move. I said, 'You didn't call out at all?' Robert said, 'No, I just stayed put. My wife always says if I get lost, stay put. So I stayed put.' I asked him about his hat. He said it had blown off down on the loop, and he hadn't been able to find it. I asked him what direction it had blown. He pointed downhill. He said, 'I figured somebody would find it.' We got him on a litter, and we got him down. He was fine. Mild hypothermia, sprained ankle, dehydrated. The wife cried at the bottom and hugged him. EMTs took him. He went home 2 days later. Case closed on paper. Dell didn't say anything to me for the rest of that morning. We did the post-search stuff, the paperwork, the debrief. Bill Reaver asked me, a little carefully, about the voice contact the night before. I told him basically that we'd had what sounded like a person calling from up the slope, and that based on the acoustics, it had seemed unsafe to send people up at night. I left out the rest. Bill looked at me for a second and then nodded and wrote something down. He didn't ask follow-up questions. I think he didn't want to. That afternoon, after we got off shift, Del asked me to come back to his place. He lived in a small house about 10 miles from the station, on a couple acres with the workshop in the back. We sat in the workshop and he opened 2 beers and he said, "I need to tell you some things, and you can believe me or not." I said, "Okay." He said, "This isn't the first time. This is the 3rd one I've been on at Cold River." I said, "Third what?" He said, "Third one where we heard somebody up a slope at night and the missing person turned out to have never called out." He told me about the other 2. One was in 2013, before I'd transferred in. A woman named Patricia from Ohio, missing off the Bluestem Trail. Search team heard her voice all night, calling from a ravine. Found her the next morning, 2 miles in the opposite direction, sleeping in a stand of laurel. She said she hadn't made a sound. She'd been too scared to call out because she thought the noises she was hearing were a bear. The other was in 2017. A teenage boy, 16, separated from his church group up on the north end. Searchers heard him for 4 hours. He was found the next day curled up under an overhang, dehydrated, and when they asked him about the calling, he said he hadn't. He'd had a panic attack and lost his voice for most of the night. Del said, in both cases, the searchers heard the missing person's voice. In both cases, the missing person never made a sound. I was on the 2017 search. We were on a slope above the kid, going the wrong way, all night, because we were following a voice that was leading us off. I asked, "Leading you where?" He said, up, always away from where the person actually was. I sat with that for a minute. I drank some of the beer, which I didn't really want. I said, "Del, I heard it use your voice." He said, "I know." I said, "How does it do that?" He said, "I don't know. I don't want to know." I asked him if he'd ever told anybody else. He said he'd told one ranger, a guy named Cobb, who had been at Cold River since the 80s, and Cobb had told him there was an old rule among the original rangers in the district. The rule was not to answer voices after dark, not to call back into the trees. If you heard somebody, you went toward them quiet. You used your whistle, not your voice. You didn't shout your name. You didn't shout your partner's name. You didn't use the radio out loud unless you absolutely had to. I said, "That's a stupid rule. We yell into the woods all the time. That's the whole job." Del said, "In the daytime, sure. After dark, in this district, you can keep your mouth shut. You'll find people the same way. You just have to be patient." I asked him if Cobb had said why. Del said, "Cobb said it learns. Whatever it is, it learns voices. The more it hears you, the better it gets at sounding like you." I went home that night and I sat on my porch and I thought about it for a long time. I told myself a lot of things over the next few weeks. I told myself Del was getting old. I told myself the voice on the slope had probably been a coyote or wind or a weird acoustic thing. Coyotes do mimic sometimes. I told myself I'd been tired and stressed, and the wife had been crying, and my brain had filled in the rest. I almost believed it. Then in February, 3 or 4 months later, I went up to Cobb's old cabin to bring him a box of files he'd asked for. Cobb was retired by then, lived alone, sharp as anything. He made me coffee and we sat at his kitchen table. I told him, kind of casually, that I'd had a weird night out on the Saddle Loop search the previous fall, and that Dell had told me about a rule. Cobb looked at me over his glasses for a long second. He said, "Dell tell you the whole thing?" I said, "I think so." Cobb said, "Did he tell you about Merrick?" I said no. Cobb went into the other room and came back with a thin manila folder. He put it on the table. He said, "This isn't official. Don't copy it. Don't take it. Just read it." The folder was about an incident in 1978. A ranger named Tom Merrick, then 31 years old, went missing during a night search for a lost Boy Scout. He went up a slope alone after hearing the kid call from a drainage. He didn't come back. They found his radio, his flashlight, and one of his boots at the top of the slope. They never found him. The Boy Scout was found alive at dawn, 2 valleys over, asleep behind a log. The scout said he hadn't called out. The folder had 3 witness statements from rangers who'd been on the search with Merrick. 2 of them said they'd heard the scout calling from the slope all evening. The 3rd said something different. That ranger said he'd heard Merrick calling after Merrick had already gone up alone. He'd heard Merrick calling for help in Merrick's voice from further up the slope, and then 10 minutes later, he'd heard Merrick calling from a different direction, lower, closer to the creek, and then both at once. He'd radioed Merrick directly and gotten no answer. Cobb said, "That ranger quit 2 weeks later, moved to Arizona." I asked what happened to Merrick. Cobb said officially he fell into a sinkhole or got taken by a bear. Unofficially, nothing. There's a memorial plaque at the station. You've walked past it 1,000 times. I had. There's a little brass plate by the back door with 3 names on it. One of them is Merrick. I'd never asked. Cobb said, "The rule about voices isn't in any handbook. Pass it on quietly. Don't make a thing of it. The new kids don't need to know yet. They'll learn, or they'll get out, or they'll be the ones we don't find." I went home that night, and I sat on my porch again, and I thought about a lot of things. The reason I'm telling you all of this now, instead of 2 years ago, is because of what happened to Dell. This was last spring, April. There was a search out near a place we call the Loomis Cut, which is an old logging area on the north end of the district. A camper had reported her boyfriend missing after a fight at their tent site. He'd walked off mad in the afternoon and hadn't come back. By dark, we had a small search going. Nothing big. 2 rangers, 3 volunteers, 1 dog. I wasn't on it. I was off shift. Dell was the lead. Around 11 that night, Dell radioed in that he had a voice contact up a draw east of the cut. Then his radio went quiet for about 15 minutes. Then he came back on and said in a normal voice, "I'm going up to check it. Hold position." The other ranger on the search, a woman named Pia, came on and said, "Dell, do you want backup?" Dell said, "No, I've got eyes on him. He's about 100 feet up. I'm going to get him." Pia said later that something about his voice sounded slightly off to her, slightly flat. But she couldn't put her finger on it, and Dell was the senior man, and she didn't question him. She said she figured he was tired. Dell didn't come back. They found his radio and his pack at the top of the draw the next day. His flashlight was on the ground next to the radio, still switched on, batteries dead. There were no signs of struggle. There were no tracks leading away from the spot. The dog they brought up wouldn't cross the top of the draw. The boyfriend was found that same morning, alive, sleeping in the back of his own truck at a pull-off 5 miles down the road. He'd hitched a ride with a logger who didn't know there was a search going on. He'd never been lost. He'd never called out. We searched for Dell for 9 days. Helicopters, dogs, drones, all of it. The county brought in a cadaver dog on day 6. We didn't find anything. Not a boot, not a piece of cloth, nothing. The official report says Dell Harkin, Ranger 57, presumed deceased, body not recovered, suspected fall in steep terrain. That's the report. 2 weeks after we called off the search, I was on a night patrol by myself. I shouldn't have been alone, but we were short and the rotation was ugly. I was driving the fire road that runs along the east edge of the Loomis Cut, just doing a standard sweep, headlights on, window cracked. It was around 2 in the morning, cold for April, low 40s, mist in the low spots. My handset crackled. A voice came over it. Not on the regular dispatch channel, on the inter-ranger channel that we use for unit to unit. The voice said, "Marty, you copy?" That's my name, Marty. I keyed up before I thought about it. I said, "Copy. Who's on?" The voice said, "Marty, I need you up at the top of the draw. I'm hurt." It was Dell. I want you to understand. I knew Dell was gone. I'd helped carry his pack out of the woods. I'd been at the little memorial his sister had put together at the station. I knew. And still, when I heard his voice on that handset, every part of me that had worked with him for over a decade said, "That's Dell. Dell needs you. Go." I sat in the truck with my hand on the wheel. The handset was on the dash. I didn't key up. I didn't answer. I just listened. The voice came again. "Marty, you there? I'm up the draw. I've been here a while. Come on." I rolled the window all the way up. I turned the heater up. I tried to think. After about a minute, the voice came a third time. It said, "Marty, please. I'm cold." That was a sentence I'd heard before, not from Dell, from the slope above the saddle loop, in a 62-year-old man's voice that didn't belong to a 62-year-old man. Same hitch, same little break at the end. I put the truck in gear and I drove to the station. I didn't answer the radio. I drove the whole 20 minutes back with the handset talking on and off, switching between Dell's voice and, for a little while, my dispatcher's voice, and once, near the end, my own voice asking me where I was going. I parked in front of the station. I sat in the truck until the radio went quiet. Then I went inside, and I logged off, and I went home, and I sat on my porch until the sun came up. I didn't file a report on that radio call. There was no report to file. The Inter-Ranger channel doesn't record. There's no proof. If I'd told my supervisor what I'd heard, the best case was a fitness for duty review. The worst case was getting Dell's death reopened in a way that would hurt his family for nothing. I told one person. I told Pia. She listened all the way through. When I was done, she said, "Okay." Then she said, "Are you keeping the rule?" I said, "Yeah, I'm keeping the rule." She said, "Good. Me too." That was about a year ago. I'm still working. I've got maybe 4 years to retirement if I want them. Some days I think I'll take them, some days I don't. The new seasonals come in every spring, and we train them the usual way. And when we get to the part about night searches, I tell them what Dell told me. I tell them, in this district, after dark, you don't call out. You whistle. You use the radio with the volume low and the squelch up. You don't shout your partner's name. You don't shout your own. If you hear somebody calling, you go toward them quiet. You don't answer. A couple of them ask why. I tell them it's an old district rule from a ranger named Cobb. I tell them sound carries strange in these hollows, and answering can pull a search team offline. That's mostly true. It's enough. Last month I trained a new kid, 22, just out of school, sharp eyes, asks good questions. Walking back to the truck after his orientation hike, he said, "Hey, can I ask you something weird?" I said, "Sure." He said, "When I was up at the overlook this morning, I heard somebody call my name from down in the trees, like twice. I figured it was you messing with me, but you were right next to me, so I stopped walking. I asked him what name they used. He said, my full name, first and last. Which is weird, because I haven't told anyone my last name out loud since I got here. I've only signed it." He laughed a little when he said it. The kind of laugh you do when you want somebody to tell you it's nothing. I didn't laugh. I told him the rule. He's still on the crew. He's a good kid. I hope he listens. There's a reason we don't answer voices after dark out here. I can't tell you what the reason is exactly. I can tell you what it sounds like and what it does and what it costs when somebody answers. I can tell you that somewhere up a draw in the Loomis Cut, there's a thing that knows how to say my name in Del Harkin's voice, and it is patient, and it is still learning. If you're ever out in the Cold River District at night and you hear somebody call to you from up a slope, do me a favor. Keep walking. Don't turn your head. Don't key the radio. Don't say a word. And if it uses your name, walk faster.